The morning Adrian Pierce turned 53, he woke up in a hotel room and lay still for almost 4 minutes before he remembered which city he was in. Denver. He was in Denver. There was a board presentation at 9, a lunch with the regional VP at noon, and a flight back to New York at 4:15. His phone showed 6 new emails, 3 text messages, and a calendar notification that read, B-Day, with a small cake emoji that someone on his assistant's team had added without asking him. He silenced the phone and got out of bed. The shower ran hot, then cold the way it always did in hotels that hadn't updated their plumbing since 2009. He stood under it longer than necessary, his palms flat against the tile wall, his eyes closed. The water drummed against his shoulders and the back of his neck, and he thought about nothing in particular. That was the thing about 53. He'd gotten very good at thinking about nothing. He was dressed and downstairs by 7:15. The hotel restaurant was open, serving the kind of breakfast that looked impressive on a menu and tasted like cardboard. He ordered coffee and a poached egg and ate standing at the window of the lobby, watching a woman try to fold a double stroller with one hand while balancing a toddler on her hip. She wasn't managing it. A man who seemed to be her husband watched from 3 feet away without helping. Adrian watched until the woman finally handed the toddler to the man, folded the stroller in 4 efficient movements, took the toddler back, and walked past the husband toward the door without a word. The man followed after a beat carrying the folded stroller. Adrian went back to his coffee. The board presentation ran 22 minutes over because one of the regional directors wanted to relitigate a decision that had already been made in October. Adrian sat through it with his hands folded and his face neutral, the way he'd learned to sit through things that frustrated him. At some point, someone asked his opinion, and he gave it quietly in 2 sentences. The room went quiet. The regional director nodded and stopped talking. Afterward, in the elevator down, his VP of operations said, "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Make people stop talking with like 11 words." Adrian looked at his reflection in the elevator doors. "I don't know," he said. "Years of practice." He did not go to the lunch. He sent the regional VP an apology and a gift card to the restaurant they'd planned to visit, then took a cab to the airport 3 hours early and sat in the Delta Sky Club with a glass of sparkling water and his laptop open and his eyes not quite focused on the screen. His return flight was delayed 40 minutes, then 80. Then the gate agent came on to announce that the aircraft had been swapped, and they were looking at a 2-hour minimum hold. He called his assistant to reschedule 2 afternoon calls. He ate a cheese plate he didn't really want. He walked from one end of the terminal to the other twice, not because he needed exercise, but because sitting still was harder than it used to be. At some point, he checked his email and found buried between a vendor contract and a newsletter. He didn't remember subscribing to a note from his personal lawyer. It was brief. It said that the Hartfield situation had been resolved and that the quarterly documents were ready for his review, and it ended with a line that said, "By the way, happy birthday." He stared at that line for a while. Then he put his phone away and looked out the terminal window at the planes moving on the tarmac below, slow and massive and patient. And he thought about the fact that he had eaten his birthday breakfast, standing up in a hotel lobby, had forgotten his birthday for most of the morning, and was now spending it in an airport 2 time zones from home, in a city he had no particular attachment to, waiting for a flight that would take him back to an apartment that would be exactly as he'd left it. He was not sad about this. That was the part that bothered him slightly more than the rest of it. He was not sad. He was just noting it. The way you might note that it was Tuesday or that it was raining. He was 53 and things had stopped landing. But the flight home went through Chicago. His connection was a different kind of delay. Not mechanical, just traffic, and by the time he landed at JFK, it was almost 9 in the evening. The city was a low orange glow below the window on the descent, millions of separate lives compressed into grids of light, all of them moving around each other in patterns he couldn't see from up here. He took a car service back to the Upper West Side. The driver didn't try to make conversation, which he appreciated. He watched the streets of Manhattan slide past the window, the lit restaurants, the people on sidewalks, a couple arguing near a parking meter, a group of teenagers taking up the whole sidewalk and none of them minding. His apartment was on the 14th floor of a building that had a doorman and a lobby with marble floors that echoed. The doorman, whose name was Gerald, said, "Evening, Mr. Pierce, happy birthday," because Gerald had worked the night shift in this building for 11 years and remembered things like that. "Thanks, Gerald," Adrian said, which was what he always said. The apartment was dark. He didn't turn on lights right away. He set his bag by the door and stood in the dark for a moment, and the city made the kind of ambient noise it always made traffic a distant siren. Someone's music drifting from a window somewhere. He knew this apartment perfectly in the dark. He'd lived here for 4 years. Before that, he'd lived in a larger apartment on the east side that he'd shared with his wife. And before that, he turned on the kitchen light. He made himself a cup of tea. He didn't particularly want, then sat at the kitchen island and opened his laptop and looked at the quarterly documents his lawyer had sent. They were dense and detailed, and he understood every line of them. He made 3 margin notes, sent 2 replies, and closed the laptop at 10:45. He was 53 years old, and the apartment was quiet, and the city hummed below him, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt what he would describe as genuinely looking forward to something. He should sleep. He had an 8 o'clock tomorrow. He sat at the island for a while longer, instead looking at nothing. 3 weeks later, he was in Portland. Not business. Or not entirely business. There was a startup he'd been considering acquiring, a small AI ethics consultancy that had built something genuinely interesting in the machine learning verification space, and the founder had asked to meet on neutral ground, meaning his own city, and Adrian had said yes because he'd wanted to see Portland anyway. He'd been to Portland twice before years ago and remembered it as the kind of city that felt slightly self-conscious about being likable, which he'd found charming. He arrived on a Wednesday, met with the founder. Thursday morning, spent 2 hours walking through their code base and asking questions, and then went back to his hotel and sat by the window looking at the Willamette River and thought about whether this acquisition made sense. It did make sense. He would probably do it. But he gave himself a day before he called anyone, because he'd learned over the years that the decisions you made in the first flush of interest were not always the decisions you would make after sleeping on them. This was one of the things he was good at, sitting with uncertainty without being rushed by it. Friday, he had no meetings. He slept until 7:30, which was late for him, and ate the hotel breakfast, which was better than Denver's, and then went for a walk without a particular destination. The morning was cool and bright, early October, the trees in the neighborhoods west of the river starting to change. He walked for almost an hour before he realized he'd walked himself into a residential commercial neighborhood. He didn't know a street of small shops and coffee places and a hardware store and what looked like a dry cleaner's that had been in business for a long time. The bakery was at the corner. It had a green awning and a hand-lettered sign in the window. Open 7 a.m. There was the smell of bread, distinct and specific, and he hadn't eaten since the hotel breakfast 3 hours ago, and there was no particular reason not to go in. The bell above the door made a small sound when he pushed it open. Inside, a counter with a glass case of pastries and breads. 4 small tables near the window, a chalkboard menu behind the counter. It was warm, and it smelled like butter and cinnamon and the faint dark note of fresh coffee. There were 2 other customers, a man reading a newspaper at one of the tables and an older woman ordering at the counter. A young woman in an apron was working the register. He was about to look at the case when he registered in his peripheral vision movement at one of the window tables. 2 girls, 7, maybe 8, sitting across from each other, sharing a cinnamon roll on a plate between them, each of them with a small cup of what appeared to be hot chocolate. They had the particular absorbed quality of children who are used to entertaining themselves. One was drawing something in a small notebook, and the other was staring out the window at the street and swinging her legs rhythmically under the table. He looked away from them, back to the pastry case. And then the woman next to them came back from the counter, setting down a coffee cup, and sat between them, and he saw her face. He would not have said later that he froze. He didn't think of it as freezing. He thought of it as his body making a decision before his brain had finished processing what his eyes were sending it. Grace Monroe was 48 years old, and she had cut her hair since the last time he'd seen her, which had been across a conference table in a mediator's office on a Tuesday afternoon 6 years ago. She'd always worn it long. Now it was shorter past her chin, but not quite to her shoulders, and it was the same dark brown with a few gray threads through it that he remembered her threatening to dye, and then not dying because she'd said she was going to accept the things she couldn't change. He could see even from 5 feet away that she had not dyed it. She was looking at the smaller of the 2 girls, or perhaps just looking slightly younger. He couldn't quite tell if they were twins from this angle and saying something, and the girl was saying something back, and Grace was smiling at whatever it was, and none of this made any sense. Grace lived in Portland. He had not known this. He had not He would have said until about 30 seconds ago known anything about where Grace lived or what she was doing or what her days looked like. They had not spoken since the divorce was final. He had hired a very good lawyer, and she had hired one too, and the whole thing had been conducted with the particular efficiency of two people who wanted to be finished with something. There was no animosity exactly. There was just an ending, clean-edged, permanent. He had thought for a long time that this was the right thing. He still thought that. He just hadn't been prepared to think it in a bakery in Portland while she was sitting 10 feet away. He should leave, or he should go to the counter and order something and leave, which was the less strange version of the same thing. Or he wasn't sure. He'd been standing here for some amount of time that he was no longer accurately tracking, and his feet had not moved. The girl who'd been looking out the window, she was now looking at him. Children did this. They hadn't learned yet that it was rude to stare openly at strangers. He met her gaze because looking away seemed stranger. She had large dark eyes and a small, serious face, with a cinnamon roll smear on one cheek that she didn't seem aware of. She looked at him with the unblinking directness of a child who was trying to figure something out. He looked back at her. He was not sure what his expression was. Then she turned to Grace. "Mom," she said. Her voice was clear and carrying the way children's voices always were in enclosed spaces. "Isn't that Daddy?" The word moved through the bakery air like something physical. He felt it in his chest. The other girl's head snapped up from her notebook. Grace's hand, which had been lifting her coffee cup, went still. "Daddy!" the other girl said louder than necessary. She was already craning to look at him. "Where? Which one?" "The tall one. Ellie," Grace said. Her voice was very controlled. "What Zoe said, Daddy, is that—" The second girl stopped talking when she finally got a full look at him. She was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then she said, "He looks like the photo, the one in the box." Sophie, quieter now. Warning note, he understood none of this. He understood that he should say something and that he was not saying anything, and that the two other customers in the bakery had both looked up and were now carefully pretending they hadn't. The young woman at the counter had frozen mid-reach for something. Grace set down her coffee cup. She turned to look at him, and her eyes. He had forgotten or had worked at forgetting what it felt like to be looked at by someone who had known you in full. Not professionally. Not as a founder or a CEO or a man with a certain kind of reputation. Someone who knew what you looked like at 2 a.m, who had seen you cry once, who had sat with you in hospitals. Grace. Monroe looked at him, and for one unguarded second, her face was exactly as it had been the last time he'd seen her, with no professional occasion to keep things controlled. The mediator's office across that table. When she'd looked at him very briefly before the lawyers started talking, and he'd thought in a way he'd never quite let himself finish the thought that she looked like someone who had accepted something very painful. Now she looked like someone who was very quickly deciding what to do. "Zoe," she said carefully, "that is not Daddy. You know we've talked about this." "He looks exactly like the photo," Zoe said. She was still staring at him matter-of-fact, the way children are matter-of-fact about things they're completely certain of. Same eyes, same she made a gesture toward her own jaw face. "People can look alike," Grace said. "You always said that, but then you—" Sophie started. "Sophie—" Both syllables clipped. That was a voice that closed a topic. Sophie closed her mouth. But she looked at him sideways with enormous interest. Zoe looked at him, then back at Grace, then at him again. "Are you sure?" she said. He had no idea what to do. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts. He had testified in front of a Senate subcommittee. He had managed over the course of his career to hold himself together in situations that most people would have found destabilizing. And he was standing in a bakery in Portland, Oregon, on a Friday morning in October, and a 7-year-old was looking at him with his former wife's eyes. He said, "I'm—" and then stopped because he had no idea how to finish that sentence. Grace was already standing up. She said something quietly to the girls, something he couldn't hear, and then she walked across the short distance between her table and where he was standing, and she stopped about 3 feet away. And she looked at him in a way that was nothing like the look of a moment ago, because now there was a whole architecture of control over it. "Adrian," she said. "Grace." His own voice sounded strange to him, quieter than he expected. She looked at him for another second. Then she looked over her shoulder briefly at the girls, who were both watching with undisguised focus. The cinnamon roll had been entirely forgotten. She turned back to him. Her voice was careful, measured. "We need to talk." He looked at the two girls. Zoe, who had started all of this, was watching him with her chin in her hands, evaluating. Sophie had gone back to her notebook but was clearly not drawing anything, just using it as a prop while she watched from her peripheral vision. He looked back at Grace. "Okay," he said. She told the girls to finish their hot chocolate and then play the word game on her phone, and she walked Adrian out onto the sidewalk in front of the bakery where the October air was cool and the street was quiet and the green awning threw a stripe of shadow across the pavement between them. He waited. He had learned over the years that waiting was often the most useful thing you could do. Grace stood with her arms folded, not defensively, more like she was holding herself together by the physical act of keeping her arms close to her body. She looked past him down the street for a moment. Then she looked back. "How long are you in Portland?" she said. "I fly out Sunday morning." She nodded, processing this. "Not here on business. I had a meeting Thursday. Today I was just—" He gestured vaguely at the street. "Walking." "Right." She exhaled. "Then, I need to explain something to you, and I need you to let me explain it in a way that doesn't— I need you to just listen first." "Okay." "Okay." She looked at him, checking that, then looked down at the sidewalk. Her coffee-colored suede boot had a small scuff on the toe, and she seemed to notice it because her eyes stopped there for a moment. "The girls are adopted," she said. "I adopted them 4 years ago. They were 3 when I brought them home. They're twins." She paused. "They're not related to you biologically. They're not related to anyone. There were no identified birth parents. So you don't need to worry about that." He said nothing. He'd known she would tell him they weren't his because he knew with absolute certainty that there was no biological possibility here. But that hadn't been the question he was actually trying to figure out how to ask. "Zoe and Sophie," Grace continued. "Sophie is the one who was drawing. Zoe is the one who—" She stopped for a second. "Zoe noticed you. I don't know exactly why she said what she said. She's been asking questions lately, about a lot of things. She said they have a photo of me." Grace closed her eyes briefly, opened them. "They found an old photo album. It was in a box of things I'd put in storage, and they found it when I reorganized the closet last spring. I didn't hide it from them deliberately. I just hadn't—" She pressed her lips together. "There are photos of you in it, from before. I explained who you were. Former husband. I didn't go into detail." "What did you tell them?" "That we'd been married and that we weren't anymore. That you were someone I used to know." She glanced back through the bakery window at the girls. Zoe had appeared to accept the phone game. Sophie was looking at the window, couldn't quite see them through the angle of the glass. Zoe has this habit of building narratives around things she doesn't fully understand. She decided somewhere along the way that you were relevant. I've told her that's not— I've corrected the idea." He looked at her face. She was not lying. She was also not telling him everything. He had enough experience reading people to know when both things were simultaneously true. "But she still said it," he said. "Just now, she saw me through a window." Grace looked genuinely tired for a second. "She also told me a substitute teacher was her real teacher because the regular teacher has short hair and the substitute has long hair, and Zoe thinks long-haired teachers are better. She constructs theories. She's 7. He almost smiled. It happened before he could stop it, the small, involuntary tug at the corner of his mouth. "What does Sophie think?" "Sophie thinks everything Zoe thinks until she thinks something different. And then she switches completely without admitting she ever agreed in the first place." Grace looked at him, and there was something, not a smile, but the suggestion of one in her eyes before it went away. "They're exhausting." "How long have you been in Portland?" 5 years. I came right after—" She paused, reorganizing whatever she'd been about to say. "I needed a change. Portland felt right. I have a job at a school here. The girls like it." "What do you teach now?" "3rd grade." A brief pause. "Same as always?" He nodded. The traffic on the street behind them had picked up slightly. A woman with a stroller went past and glanced at them with the incurious speed of someone who saw strangers having quiet conversations on sidewalks all the time. "I didn't know you were here," he said. "I want you to know that. This wasn't deliberate." "I know," she said, and she said it without hesitation, which he appreciated. "What happens now?" he said. Grace looked at him steadily. "What do you mean?" "You said we need to talk." "I've been waiting for the talk." She seemed to consider her options. She uncrossed her arms and put her hands in the pockets of her jacket instead. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need to think about what's best for them. For Zoe, especially." She looked at the sidewalk again. "She's going to ask me tonight what happened. Why did I not introduce her to the tall man in the bakery? She's going to ask me who you are, and she's... Grace stopped. She's been asking questions about fathers in general. Her friend at school has a father who coaches her soccer team, and Zoe decided about 2 weeks ago that she has feelings about this. He said nothing. He was watching her face. She doesn't have a father. Grace continued, quieter now. She has me. That's what she has, and it's what I've always told her is enough. And it is enough. They are loved and safe, and they have a good life. She said this like someone who had said it before to herself in the dark. But she's 7, and she's figuring out that the world has fathers in it, and she's starting to wonder about hers. He was quiet for a moment. And she saw my picture. And she saw your picture, Grace agreed. And she decided. A long pause. I'm not asking you to... She stopped herself again, and he could see her being careful about language. I don't want you to feel obligated to anything. You don't know them. You have no... She exhaled. You have a life. You have a company. I do. I'm not trying to complicate that. He looked at her. Grace Monroe at 48 looked like someone who had been through things and come out the other side without needing to be validated for it. She looked tired in the way people look tired when they're holding a lot, and she looked steady in the way people look steady when they've had to be steady for a long time. She looked like herself, which was a strange thought, because of course she did, but what he meant was that she looked like the person he remembered, not frozen, not preserved, but continuous. Like there was a through line. He said, "Can I meet them?" She blinked. "Properly," he said. "Not," he nodded toward the window. "Not like this, but if they have questions and if you're trying to figure out how to answer them, maybe there's a version of this where I'm just a person you used to know who happens to be in town this weekend and we have coffee, and they can see that I'm just a regular person and not whatever Zoe's decided I am." Grace looked at him for a long time. "That's either a very simple idea," she said finally, "or a very complicated one. Probably both." She looked down at the scuffed boot again. "Back up. Let me think about it," she said. "Give me your number. I'll think about it and I'll let you know today." He told her the number. She typed it into her phone. She looked at the screen for a second and then back at him, and her face was doing the thing he remembered from the hardest parts of their marriage, the part where everything that was the most important was the part she didn't say. "Adrian," she said. "Yeah. They're good girls. Whatever happens this weekend, I want you to know that. Whatever you decide, they're really good." She said it like she needed him to have that information, like she needed someone outside her daily life to know it and confirm that it was true. "I can already tell," he said. She looked at him, something undefended in her face for a brief second. Then she nodded and went back inside. Through the window, he could see her go back to the table, sit down, hand Sophie her coffee cup lid to fidget with. She'd always been good at redirecting children, even back when she'd taught second grade, and he'd come to pick her up after late meetings and stood outside her classroom watching her without her knowing he was there. Zoe was already asking something he could tell from the way her hands moved. Grace said something, and Zoe processed it and then seemed to accept it, turning back to the phone. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer. Then he walked. He didn't have a destination. He walked the same way he'd walked before, not tracking distance, not counting time. And he went over the morning in his mind with the kind of methodical care he brought to problems he didn't yet understand. Grace had adopted 2 girls. She'd done it alone 4 years ago when the girls were 3. She'd moved to Portland 5 years ago, right after the divorce. He thought about the timing. The divorce had been finalized in the spring. She'd moved to Portland that fall. Within a year of that, she'd started the adoption process. He didn't know what to do with that information. He put it in a mental folder and kept walking. She had told them he was someone she used to know. She had shown them a photo, even if accidentally. Zoe, age 7, had built a story around the information, and when she'd seen a 6'1" man in an October jacket with his particular jaw and eyes walk into a bakery, she'd done what 7-year-olds did with the stories they'd built. She'd slotted him in. He tried to think about what he felt about all of this. What he mostly felt was the distinct and uncomfortable awareness that he had stood in that bakery like a piece of furniture, saying almost nothing, processing almost nothing, and that the 2 most real things that had happened were a child. Saying a word that had landed somewhere in his chest, he hadn't expected it to land, and then Grace looking at him with that face that meant everything important was the thing she wasn't saying. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant about the Sunday flight. He wrote back, confirmed the details, and put his phone away. He walked for another 40 minutes. He found himself at a park along the river, a stretch of green with benches and joggers, and a dog walker managing 4 dogs in varying states of cooperation. He sat on a bench and watched the river for a while. He thought about the last time he'd felt something land. He couldn't place the moment precisely. There had been moments that were significant, a deal that had felt genuinely meaningful, an article about their AI ethics work that had said something he was proud of, a dinner with an old friend who'd said something honest and real. But landing was different. Landing was the thing that went past significance into the body, into whatever the chest was for when it wasn't being a ribcage. A 7-year-old had looked at him and said a word, and something had moved. He didn't know what it meant. He was 53 years old, and he was still trying to figure out what things meant, which seemed like a failure of analysis, but which he was slowly accepting as just the condition of being a person. His phone buzzed again. He looked down. Unknown number, Portland area code. A text. Are you free at 10 tomorrow morning? There's a park on S.E. Hawthorne. The girls like the swings. He sat with it for a second. Then he wrote back, I'll be there. He spent the afternoon doing what he'd originally planned to do in Portland, which was to walk and think about the acquisition. He walked through neighborhoods he didn't know, bought a very good cup of pour-over coffee at a place that took coffee seriously in the way Portland places took coffee seriously, and thought about the machine learning verification company and whether the founder had the right temperament for a post-acquisition structure and whether the technology was actually as novel as it seemed, or whether they'd done a good job of making incremental improvements sound like breakthroughs. By 5 o'clock, he'd decided to go ahead with the acquisition pending due diligence, which he'd largely already known. He sent a brief message to his head of M&A saying so. Then he sat in a cafe with the rest of his coffee and found himself thinking about Zoe's face. She had looked at him with such complete and unreserved certainty. The photo in the box, the old photo album, whatever she'd constructed from the fragments, and then she'd seen a real person and said simply, there you are, not as if it were a hope, as if it were a fact she'd verified. He tried to remember what that felt like to be that certain about something without needing it to be confirmed by anyone else. He thought he had been that certain once, about Grace, about the company, about the idea that the life he was building was the right one. He'd been very certain for a long time, and then he'd been very wrong quietly in ways he hadn't noticed until the wrongness was comprehensive. He went back to the hotel at 6. He ordered room service, something simple, and ate it at the desk while he read through the quarterly documents his lawyer had sent, the ones he'd looked at on his birthday and then put aside. He made the notes he needed to make, sent the relevant messages, and was done by 8:30. He showered, turned out the lights, lay in the hotel bed. He was in Portland on a Friday night, and tomorrow morning he was going to a park on S.E. Hawthorne, which he'd Googled and found was a neighborhood he hadn't been to. He was going to see 2 7-year-old girls who liked the swings, and one of whom had found his photograph in a box. He was not sure what he was feeling. He was sure in a way that surprised him slightly that he wanted to go. He stared at the dark ceiling for a while. The room hummed with its air conditioning. The city outside was quiet in the specific way of hotel rooms where the soundproofing took the outside world and made it distant and theoretical. He thought about the box with the photograph in it. What else had been in it? Whether Grace had known what was in it before Zoe found it, or whether she'd also discovered in some ways something she'd half forgotten. He thought about her face when she came back from the counter and saw him standing in the bakery. The fraction of a second before the architecture of control went up, she had not expected to see him. He was sure of that. Whatever else he didn't know, he was sure of that. He closed his eyes. He would go to the park at 10 o'clock and see what happened. He was good at going to things and seeing what happened. He'd built most of his company that way. He just hadn't done it in a while. He fell asleep thinking about the sound of the bakery bell above the door, the small, clear sound of it, and the girl swinging her legs under the table and the notebook and the cinnamon roll going forgotten on its plate. Chan. The park on S.E. Hawthorne was at the end of a tree-lined street smaller than he'd expected, a neighborhood park rather than a grand public space with a climbing structure and swings and a sand pit and a few picnic tables near the edge, a group of older trees that had been there long enough to make good shade. The October morning was sharper than the day before, the kind of cold that was still polite. He arrived at 9:58, which was how he arrived at things. Grace was already there, sitting on a bench near the swings with a travel coffee cup and a book she wasn't reading. The girls were on the swings. He could hear them before he saw them clearly, a sound like argument which resolved into competition as he got closer because they were arguing about who could get higher. He stopped a few feet from the bench. Grace looked up. "Hi," she said. "Hi." She moved slightly to one side of the bench without making a production of it, and he sat down at the other end. They both looked at the swings. Sophie was winning the height competition, but this appeared to be because she was cheating. She'd picked the swing with more slack in the chain, which gave her a longer arc. He wasn't sure if she knew this or had figured it out instinctively. Zoe had noticed she was behind and was pumping with grim focus, her face set. "Zoe's very competitive," Grace said quietly. "I noticed. Sophie's sneakier." He looked at Sophie's swing arc. She picked the better equipment. Grace glanced at him sideways. "She does that. I don't know if it's strategic or just lucky." They watched in silence for a moment. The morning around them was ordinary Saturday park sounds. A dog somewhere, kids at the climbing structure on the other side, the distant clean noise of a leaf blower 2 streets over. "I thought about how to do this," Grace said. "What to say to them this morning." She paused. "I told them we might run into the man from the bakery, that I knew him from a long time ago, that his name was Adrian." Another pause. "That's it. I didn't give them more than that." "Okay." Zoe accepted it because she'd already decided what she thought. And Sophie is reserving judgment. She sounded not quite amused. Affectionate. She said, and I quote, "Is he nice?" And I said yes. And she said, "How do you know?" And I said, "I used to know him." And she said, "But how do you know now?" And then she went back to her cereal. "That's a fair question." "Yes," Grace said. "It is." He turned his head to look at her profile. She was looking at the girls. After a moment, she seemed to feel his attention and turned to look at him. And the question that they were both not asking was present between them in the way that unasked questions were not comfortably, but with the specific weight of something that had agreed for now to wait. Zoe had spotted him. She stopped swinging. She sat on the swing and used her feet to slow herself down and watched him from 15 feet away with her head tilted slightly to one side. Sophie kept going for another few seconds. Then she too slowed, and then they were both looking at him from the swings. He raised his hand. A small wave, the kind you gave to people you weren't yet sure of. Zoe tilted her head the other way. Then she got off the swing, crossed the distance, and stopped about 4 feet in front of the bench. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. She studied him. "You're the man from the bakery." "I am." "Mom said your name is Adrian." "That's right." She considered this. "Are you from here?" "No, I'm from New York." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Do you live in a big building?" "I do." "Sophie wants to live in a big building," she said with the tone of someone reporting something that she found slightly misguided. "I want to live in a house with a yard." "Do you have a yard now?" "We have a porch." "Mom says that's enough yard." She looked back at Sophie, who had also gotten off the swing and was approaching more slowly. "Sophie, he's from New York." Sophie stopped next to her sister. She looked at him without Zoe's directness, more sidelong, more evaluative. She looked, he thought, very much like Grace when Grace was deciding something. "Did you see the Statue of Liberty?" Sophie asked. "I've seen it from a distance," he said. "I don't take the boat tour." "Why not?" "I've lived there a long time. After a while, you stop doing the tourist things." Sophie appeared to find this disappointing in a polite way. "We went to the Space Needle," she said. "It was cold at the top." "It usually is." Grace had opened her book again, which he understood as deliberate. She was giving this space without managing it. Zoe climbed onto the bench beside him without asking permission, sitting close, but not touching in the way children occupied space near unfamiliar adults present, but technically maintaining deniability. "Mom says you know each other from a long time ago," she said. "We do." "How long?" He thought about it. "More than 10 years?" Zoe processed this. 10 years was longer than she'd been alive. "That's really long," she said seriously. "It is." "Do you still know each other, or do you just know each other from before?" He paused. It was a precise question. He looked at Grace, who was reading with the particular non-reading quality of someone tracking a conversation without appearing to. "Right now," he said carefully, "we're figuring that out." Zoe seemed to accept this as a reasonable answer. Sophie had sat down on the other side of him also without asking, and was now examining the laces on her own shoes with the intensity of someone who is definitely not listening. "Did you know we were adopted?" Zoe said. "Zoe," Grace said without looking up. "What he probably knows. Mom told him stuff." "Your adoption is your story to share or not share," Grace said. "We've talked about this." Zoe thought about this. "Okay," she said. Then to Adrian, "Did you know?" He understood from Grace's intervention that there was a lesson she was trying to teach Zoe about privacy and ownership of her own story, and that this was not a moment to subvert that lesson. "Your mom mentioned it," he said, "but I think it's your story to tell, or not tell, like she said." Zoe absorbed this. She kicked her feet not quite long enough to reach the ground from the bench. "I decided I don't mind if people know," she said. "Sophie doesn't like to talk about it, but I don't mind." "That's okay," he said. "You're allowed to have different feelings about it." "Ms. Patterson says that too," Zoe said. "She's our teacher. She says everyone gets to feel what they feel." "Ms. Patterson sounds smart." "She is. She has really good snacks too." Zoe turned to look at him directly. "Do you have kids?" He felt it, the question. A small weight. "No." "Why not?" "Zoe." Grace's voice had more edge to it this time. "I'm just asking." "That's a personal question." Zoe considered this. "Sorry," she said to him in the voice of someone performing contrition without fully feeling it. "It's okay," he said. Sophie, who had been examining her laces with great focus, said quietly, and without looking up, "I want to go on the climbing thing." "Okay," Grace said. Sophie got up. She looked at him once quickly, not Zoe's direct appraisal, but something quicker and harder to read, and then walked toward the climbing structure. Zoe watched her go. Then she looked at Adrian, then at Grace, then back at Adrian. "Sophie gets shy," she announced, as if this were important information he should have. "But she's not mean. She just doesn't trust people fast." "That seems wise," he said. Zoe seemed surprised by this answer. "Mommy says it too," she said. "Your mom usually is," he said. Grace looked up from her book at this just briefly, and their eyes met, and then she looked back down. Zoe hopped off the bench. "I'm going on the climbing thing too," she said. Then she stopped and turned back. "Will you push us on the swings?" He hadn't pushed a child on a swing in his life. He was not sure he knew how. "Sure," he said. Zoe broke into a grin, fast, bright, the kind that happened before a child decided whether to do it. Then she was running toward the climbing structure, calling Sophie's name with the specific urgency of someone who had important news. He sat on the bench next to Grace, and they were both quiet for a moment. "That went better than I expected," Grace said finally. Sophie has reservations." "Sophie always has reservations." She paused. "She liked that you said being cautious was wise." He looked at the climbing structure where Zoe had reached Sophie and appeared to be delivering a report. Sophie listened, glanced over at the bench, and then turned back to the climbing structure and began climbing it. "Does she know the swings thing is coming?" he said. "Zoe is probably telling her right now." He watched Zoe point. Sophie looked over again this time with a slightly longer look, and then she climbed to the top of the structure and sat down. "She's deciding," Grace said. He nodded. They sat together in the pale October light, not saying anything, and the park moved around them, and the morning was ordinary and specific, and the sky was high and pale, and the leaves were turning, and he thought, this is a thing that happened. This happened today. He didn't know yet what it meant. He knew it had happened, and that he was here, and that he was 53 years old and had not thought in years about pushing anyone on a swing, and now he was about to. Zoe came running back. Sophie followed more slowly, hands in her pockets. "Swings," Zoe announced. "Swings," he agreed. He stood up, and they went to the swings, and he stood behind them, and they told him how hard to push with the authority of children who have very clear standards, and he pushed, and the morning went on, and Grace watched from the bench, and above them the October trees were losing their leaves one at a time into the pale Portland sky. He had pushed Zoe first, then Sophie, then both at once, which required a rhythm. He had to calibrate. Push left, swing, step right. Push right, swing, step back. Repeat. He got it wrong twice. Zoe told him he was doing it with too much wrist, which was probably not real swing pushing instruction, but which he treated seriously nonetheless. Sophie did not give instructions. She just pumped with her legs when he was off rhythm, compensating. After about 15 minutes, they abandoned the swings for the climbing structure. He went back to the bench and sat with Grace. "You look terrified," she said. "I wasn't terrified. You looked like you were performing a technical task." "I was." She laughed. It surprised him, not that she laughed, but the sound of it. It was the same actual sound, and he had not heard it in 6 years, and it arrived somewhere behind his sternum and stayed there. You always did that, she said. Made things into systems. It worked. Reasonably well, she said. Not unkind, just accurate. He looked at the climbing structure. Zoe was at the top. Sophie was halfway up, moving methodically, not rushing. How long has it been just the three of you? Since they came home. 4 years. She paused. My sister comes to visit, and I have good people here, a couple of teachers. I'm close with the parents of some of the girls' friends. We're not isolated. She said it like she was answering a question he hadn't quite asked. I wasn't implying that. I know. A pause. I'm aware it sounds like a certain kind of life. Divorced teacher, 2 kids, small city. I live alone in a big apartment in New York, he said. I'm not exactly positioned to comment on anyone's life. She looked at him sideways. That's the first semi-honest thing you've said. He considered this. I've been semi-honest the whole time. No, she said, not harshly. You've been polite. You're very good at polite. You always were. She turned back to the climbing structure. I'm not saying that as a criticism. It's useful. There's a cost. He didn't answer immediately. She was right, and he knew she was right. And he thought about the hotel room, and the birthday, and the sparkling water in the Delta Sky Club, and the long string of days that had felt like tasks completed. There's a cost, he said. She seemed to accept the agreement without pressing it. Zoe called from the top of the climbing structure. Mom, do we have lunch after this? We have lunch after this, Grace called back. Can we get the noodles? We can get the noodles. Zoe said something to Sophie, and then they both started making their way down. There's a noodle place on Hawthorne that they've declared the only acceptable Saturday lunch, Grace said quietly. Zoe went through a phase where she wanted a sandwich every day for 3 months, and I thought we were done with phases, but no. Now it's noodles. Every Saturday. Without fail. He smiled at this. What kind of noodles? Pho, which I still find vaguely remarkable for a 7-year-old, but apparently it's the broth. Zoe's or Sophie's idea. Zoe's. Sophie adopted it and now claims it was always her idea too. She said this with the weary affection of someone who had given up trying to reconstruct who had originated what in this particular 2-person ecosystem. The girls reached the bottom and ran over. Zoe was flushed from the cold strands of hair escaping from her ponytail. Sophie looked exactly as composed as she had at the start, he was beginning to understand simply how Sophie was. Are you getting lunch? Zoe asked him. He looked at Grace. Grace looked at him with an expression that did not commit to anything. I don't want to intrude on the noodles, he said. Zoe looked puzzled by this concept. There's always room for one more person. Mom says that. I say that about different situations, Grace said. Can he come? Grace looked at him with the specific expression of someone who is being maneuvered by a 7-year-old and knows it and is deciding whether to fight it. If he wants to, she said finally. He did want to. He hadn't expected to, but he did. Sure, he said. Zoe looked satisfied as though she had organized this, which perhaps she had. They walked to the noodle place, which was 4 blocks away on a street with a bookshop and a used record store and a flower shop with buckets of orange and yellow flowers on the sidewalk. Zoe pointed out the flower shop. Mom always says she's going to buy flowers, and then she doesn't, she said. I buy flowers sometimes, Grace said. You buy them at the grocery store, Zoe said. That's different. It's exactly the same flower. It doesn't feel the same, Zoe said with the absoluteness of someone who has feelings about this. Sophie said nothing but looked briefly at the bucket of orange flowers as they passed. The noodle place was small, maybe 8 tables, warm and steamy, and smelling of star anise and bone broth. The woman at the counter appeared to recognize Grace and the girls and gestured them toward a table in the back. Sophie and Zoe took seats across from each other, and Grace sat beside Sophie. He sat beside Zoe. Menus were not needed. Grace ordered for the table pho for the girls, which they accepted with the gravity of people confirming an expected thing, and then she looked at him. Do you eat pho at? I've eaten pho. That's a non-answer. I like it fine, he said. I'm not picky. She ordered 2 more bowls and they brought water, and Zoe immediately put both hands around her water glass, and Sophie arranged her chopsticks carefully on the napkin. He looked at the 2 of them the way Zoe was already talking, telling Grace something about a boy at school who had stepped on her drawing and hadn't apologized, and the way Sophie was listening with what he was starting to recognize as Sophie's baseline expression, which was attentive and unsurprised and faintly diagnostic. He thought these are Grace's daughters. Not his, not anyone's, but hers. But they existed in the world because Grace had chosen them, had brought them home, had given them pho on Saturdays, and the particular kind of parenting where you didn't always buy the flower shop flowers, but you knew which ones your kid liked. He had missed all of it, not because he'd been excluded, because he hadn't known it existed. It had been happening parallel to his life 4 blocks or 4,000 miles from wherever he'd been. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He put it in the same folder as the other things he wasn't sure about yet and looked at the menu board above the counter. "She told me," Sophie said. He looked at her. She was looking at him with calm directness. "Sorry. Zoe told me what you said at the park." Sophie set her chopsticks down parallel and precise. That being cautious was wise. "Yes," he said. "Do you believe that—" He thought about it. He could have given a performative answer, something agreeable that didn't mean much. He looked at her face and decided she would know if he did that. "Yes," he said. "I do. I've learned it the hard way." Sophie considered this. Then, okay. She went back to her water glass. But something in her posture had shifted slightly, infinitesimally, the readout on a piece of equipment that has been recalibrated. Zoe had finished her story about the boy in the drawing and was now looking at him. "What do you do?" she said. "For work. I run a company." "What kind?" "Technology," he said. "We make software that helps other companies figure out if their AI systems are working correctly." Zoe's face showed polite incomprehension. "Like fixing computers?" "Sort of. More like—" He paused. "Making sure the computers are telling the truth." Zoe's eyebrows went up. "Computers can lie. They can make mistakes that look like lying. We check for that." She thought about this. "Miss Patterson says lying and making mistakes are different things." "She's right. But sometimes it feels the same," Zoe said. He looked at her. "It does sometimes." The pho arrived enormous bowls with fragrant dark broth and noodles and herbs and thin slices of beef. He watched the girls go through the ritual of adding things: Zoe with bean sprouts, but no jalapeno. Sophie with jalapeno and no sprouts, both with a specific proportion of hoisin and sriracha that they accomplished without measuring. Grace added nothing, just picked up her spoon. He added the herbs and a little of the sriracha and picked up his own spoon. "Good," Grace said. "It's good," he said. Across the table, Zoe was leaning over her bowl, already eating with the focused pleasure of someone who is confident in their order. Sophie was eating more carefully, watching the table. She looked up at him once quickly and then back at her bowl. This, he thought. This is what had been happening on Saturdays and on school mornings and on whatever other days in this city he hadn't known about, in this booth he'd never been in. He ate his pho and listened to Zoe talk about the drawing and the apologizing and whether an apology you didn't mean counted as an apology, and Grace said she thought intention mattered, and Zoe said then what was the point of making someone apologize if they didn't mean it? And Grace said the point was that sometimes saying the words helped you get there, and Adrian thought that is either very wise or very wrong, and I'm not sure which. He didn't say that. He listened, and he ate, and he watched the three of them, and the steam rose from the bowls, and the restaurant was warm, and the street outside moved with Saturday morning people, and the hour passed. He flew home Sunday morning the way he'd planned and landed at JFK at 5:15 in the afternoon and took the car service back to the Upper West Side, and Gerald said good evening, and he went up to the 14th floor and set his bag down by the door. He stood in the apartment for longer than usual before he turned on any lights. He was not sure what he was processing. He was good as a rule at processing things, at taking information and holding it from a slight remove, analyzing it for the relevant variables, arriving at conclusions. He'd built a company this way. He'd navigated the divorce this way. He had walked himself through a lot of difficult years by making each thing into a problem with possible solutions and then choosing among them. This did not feel like that. What it felt like was something had shifted very slightly without making a sound, and he was now standing in a landscape that was identical to the one he'd been in before, except that everything in it had moved 1 millimeter to the left. He unpacked his bag. He made tea. He sat at the kitchen island with his laptop open and did not do any work. He had Grace's number in his phone. He had taken it when she gave it to him for the park arrangement, and he'd noticed distantly that he did not have her number before that. He'd had it once. It had been programmed into his phone as G for 2 years, and then he deleted it on the day the mediator handed him a pen and told him where to sign. He didn't remember making the decision. He'd just known that having it there would make everything harder, and he was trying to make things easier, which was what he was good at. Now he had it again. It was just a number. He was not going to text her tonight because there was nothing to say, and because she was probably getting 2 7-year-olds ready for Monday, and that was its own kind of work. He looked at the kitchen wall. Then he looked at his laptop. Then he got up and put his teacup in the sink and went to bed at 8:30, which was very early, and lay awake for almost 2 hours thinking about a girl's cinnamon roll smear and another girl's carefully parallel chopsticks and the way faux broth smelled in a small warm room. He called Grace on Tuesday. He had not planned the call. He'd been in his office in the late afternoon after a meeting that had gone well and before a meeting that wouldn't, and he'd picked up his phone meaning to check his messages and found himself on the call screen. She answered on the third ring. Adrian? Hi. He paused. He hadn't prepared anything. How are they? A brief silence. They're fine. Good. Zoe has been talking about New York. To her class, to everyone. Her stuffed animals, me. He could hear the low background of a house with children in it. Distant voices, something being knocked over the particular ambient noise of not quite quiet. Sophie asked me this morning if you lived near Central Park. I'm about 8 blocks away. I'll tell her that. She'll want to know if you can see the horses from your window. A pause. There's a book about Central Park she's interested in. She's going through a phase of reading about places she wants to go. Where does she want to go? New York. The Grand Canyon. A place in Iceland where you can see the northern lights. Patagonia. Grace paused. She's 7. I try not to limit the scope. He thought about this. And Zoe. Zoe wants to go to the state fair. She saw a photo of a deep-fried Oreo, and that's been the ambition for 6 weeks. A pause. They're different. I noticed. The phone was quiet for a moment. The comfortable type that sits between two people who are trying to figure out what the actual conversation is supposed to be. I've been thinking, he said. About what? About whether there's a way to... He stopped, reconsidered the construction. I go to Portland regularly now. The acquisition I'm working on. It's going to require about 6 trips over the next 4 months, and 2 of those will run over weekends. Okay, Grace said. Neutral. I'm not suggesting anything, he said. I just I'd like to not disappear, if that makes sense. Whatever this is, whatever we figure out it is, I don't want to treat it as a thing that happened once, and then I went back to my life. The silence this time was different. That's honest, Grace said finally. I'm trying. What would not disappearing look like to you? He thought about it. I don't know exactly. Checking in. If it seems okay. If Zoe... He paused. Zoe is going to wonder. I don't want her to get an answer she didn't expect. Sophie too, Grace said. Sophie just doesn't tell you she's wondering. I figured. Another pause. A sound in the background, Zoe's voice raised, asking something. Grace said something away from the phone, then came back. They're doing homework. It's... A breath. I'm not against what you're saying. I just want to be clear about something. Okay? I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for them. If whatever this is, if it's something you're deciding to try, then it has to be consistent. They can't have someone show up and be present and then not be. Zoe's already built something in her head. I can't undo that, and I don't think it would be good to try. But if it turns out to be something that goes away, her voice was controlled, careful, the way it always was when she was saying something important without raising the stakes. I need that not to happen. I understand, he said. Do you? I do. He paused. I'm not making you a promise I don't intend to keep. I know I'm 53 and I live in New York and I have a company. I know the practical reality, but I'm asking to figure out what's possible, not to make guarantees I don't have yet. She was quiet for a moment. That's also honest, she said. I'm on a streak. She made a sound that might have been the ghost of a laugh. Okay, she said. Next time you're in Portland, let me know in advance. I will. And Adrian, she paused. Yeah. The girls don't know all of it. They don't know how we know each other beyond former husband. I'd like to keep it that way for now. They don't need to know the story. He understood what she meant by the story. The miscarriage. The long silences before the end. The mediator's office. The specific geography of how 2 people who had started well could end badly by degrees, not through malice, just through the accumulated weight of things unsaid. They won't hear it from me, he said. Thank you, she said. After they hung up, he sat in his office for a few minutes. The city was doing its 4:45 thing outside his windows going yellow, the light getting long. He thought about Grace's voice when she said, "I'm not doing this for you," and the way she'd meant it without cruelty, just as a fact. He had always respected her precision. He went back to Portland 3 weeks later. The acquisition due diligence was in a specific complicated phase that required his presence, and he flew out on a Wednesday evening and was in town through Saturday afternoon. He texted Grace from the airport on Wednesday in town Wednesday to Saturday. No pressure. Whenever works, if it works. She replied Thursday morning, Saturday morning, same park. He wrote back, yes. He spent Thursday and Friday in meetings that required most of his concentration. Technical reviews. Legal discussions. The particular kind of attention that a good acquisition required if you were going to do it responsibly rather than just quickly. He was good at this. He went to the meetings, he asked the right questions, he took notes in the particular shorthand he'd been using for 20 years that only he could read. On Friday afternoon, the founder of the company, a woman named Priya, who was 38, and had the particular intensity of people who have built something good and are terrified of what happens next, pulled him aside after the last session and said, "Can I ask you something off the record?" "Sure," he said. "Are you doing this because you believe in what we're doing or because you need a good-looking acquisition for the year-end report?" He looked at her. She was wearing the expression of someone who had decided to ask the real question rather than wait for the real answer. "Both can be true," he said. "I know," she said. "I need to know which one is driving." "I've been in AI ethics since before it was a category anyone cared about," he said. "I started because I believed it was necessary. I've added 20 people in the last 3 years who are genuinely excellent at this kind of work. I'm not going to tell you that acquisition decisions are never about optics, but I will tell you that if you talk to my team, you'll find out pretty quickly that we don't keep things that don't work." Priya looked at him for a long moment, then she nodded. "Okay," she said. "Is that enough?" he said. "It's a start." She picked up her bag. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing this right. You're the first acquirer who asked to review our failure documentation before our success metrics." He shrugged. "Successes tell you what you did. Failures tell you who you are." She laughed. "I'm going to write that down." "Please don't," he said. Someone else said it first.
But
Saturday morning was clear and colder than his last visit, the October having deepened into early November. The park on Hawthorne felt different in the cold, the trees were mostly bare now, and the sky was a high, thin blue, and the children in the park were moving faster, chased by the temperature. He got there at 9:57. Grace was already on the bench. The girls were on the swings again. He could hear them from across the park. Sophie this time was giving instructions. "You have to lean back on the downswing," Sophie was saying, "not forward." "I know how to swing," Zoe said. "You're not leaning back." "I lean back a different amount." "That's not how physics works." He sat down beside Grace. "She figured it out," he said quietly. "Sophie figured out the chain slack thing 4 days ago. She's been testing the physics ever since." Grace wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "She came home with a library book about pendulums." "She's 7. She is. Don't underestimate her because of it." Not a warning exactly, more like useful information. He did not think he'd been underestimating Sophie. He thought he'd been watching her carefully since the moment she'd set her chopsticks parallel on the napkin. Zoe had spotted him. She stopped swinging, stood up from the swing. While it was still moving, he started to stand involuntarily. But she landed perfectly fine, because of course she did, and ran over. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. "Sophie figured out the swing thing. I heard. She's been very annoying about it." She climbed onto the bench beside him the same way as last time, and looked up at him with the directness he was starting to expect. "Did you bring anything?" He looked at her. "Was I supposed to?" She shrugged. "I don't know. People usually bring things when they come to visit." "Zoe," Grace said. "It's not a hint," Zoe said clearly, having previously been told that this was a hint. "I'm just saying." "You're fine," Adrian said to Grace. Then to Zoe, "I didn't bring anything this time. I'll know for next time." Zoe accepted this with the diplomatic grace of someone who has also been told not to push. "Okay." She kicked her feet. "Did you get a new thing in Portland?" "What kind of thing?" "Like a work thing. You said you were working." "I did have work, yes." "Did it go well?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "It went well." She nodded, satisfied. "Sophie thinks you're interesting," she said. Then, as if she'd accidentally revealed state secrets, "She didn't say that. I'm just saying she thinks it." "Zoe." Grace's voice had the particular quality of someone managing a situation that was going to require several subsequent conversations. What? It's a compliment. Sophie had arrived at the bench, moving at her standard, unhurried pace. She sat on Grace's other side and pulled her jacket zipper up to her chin and looked at him across her mother. She told you, Sophie said. I guessed, he said. Sophie looked at her sister with the specific expression of someone measuring the gap between what they said and what happened. I barely said anything, Zoe said. You said the whole thing. I said a version. He looked at Grace, who appeared to be suppressing a smile with her coffee cup. She caught his eye and looked quickly away, which meant the suppression was less successful than intended. Sophie, he said, do you actually think I'm interesting? Sophie considered the question with the gravity it deserved. I think you're different than I expected, she said. That's not the same as interesting, but it might turn into it. He nodded. That's fair. She seemed satisfied with this answer. She pulled out a small book from her jacket pocket, physically small, the kind with a flexible cover, and opened it to a page she'd marked with a folded corner. What are you reading? He said. She showed him the cover. It was a book about the geology of the Pacific Northwest. We went to a science museum, Grace said. She came home with 3 books from the gift shop. The rocks in Oregon are interesting, Sophie said, not looking up from the page. They are, he said. She looked up at that briefly. I've been to Mount St. Helens, he said. The geology there is... He paused, trying to think of the right thing for a 7-year-old who was reading about rocks and was clearly not going to be condescended to. It's a good example of how the same event can both destroy and create things. Sophie looked at him steadily. The eruption made new soil, she said. Eventually. It did. Not for a while, though. No, he said. Not for a while. She seemed to consider this as a statement about more than rocks. Then she went back to her page. Zoe, who had been listening to this exchange with the patience of someone who was not particularly interested in rocks, but was very interested in everything else, said, Can we get the good hot chocolate today? The one from the bakery. Grace looked at him. The bakery's a few blocks away. He understood the sentence. She was telling him the origin of their current arrangement, the bakery on the corner, the green awning, and asking without asking whether he was all right with going back to it. I like that bakery, he said. Zoe jumped off the bench. The bakery on the corner. He pushed open the door and the bell made its small sound again, and the room was the same warm butter and cinnamon, the chalkboard menu, and the young woman at the counter smiled at Grace, and the girls the way she smiled at people she recognized. He stood at the counter while Grace ordered for the girls 2 hot chocolates and a cinnamon roll to share, and he looked at the pastry case and tried to remember where he'd been standing 3 weeks ago when he'd walked in and seen everything change. He was standing in approximately the same spot. He ordered a coffee and a small almond pastry he didn't entirely want, and they took a table, not the window table this time, a different one closer to the back because that one was occupied, and Grace sat across from the girls, and he sat beside Grace because the geometry of the seating required it, and the warm air of the bakery settled around them. This is where I said it, Zoe said conversationally, as if this were a thing he should be updated on. I know, he said. Was it weird? Yes, he said. She seemed pleased by this honesty. I thought you might be mad. Why would I be mad? She shrugged. Sometimes grown-ups are mad when you say something they weren't expecting. I wasn't mad, he said. I was surprised. You didn't look surprised, she said. You looked like nothing. Grace had taken a sudden interest in her coffee cup. He thought about this. I process things slowly sometimes, he said. The face catches up eventually. Zoe studied him. Mom does that too, she said. But different. Mom's face catches up fast. She just doesn't always show what it says. Zoe, Grace said. What? It's true. You're very observant, he said to Zoe. She sat up slightly. Ms. Patterson says that too. Ms. Patterson and I agree. Sophie, who had been eating her half of the cinnamon roll with focused attention, said without looking up, Zoe told our class about you. The table went momentarily quiet. Sophie, Grace said, I'm just saying what happened. Sophie looked up perfectly calm. She told Amara, and Amara told the whole class. Zoe looked at her sister with a complicated expression. I told Amara because she's my best friend. I know. And then she told everyone. Sophie turned to Adrian. They were asking if you'd come to school. He looked at Grace. Her expression was the careful one, the one behind which things were moving. Zoe, she said, we talked about this. I didn't tell everyone, Zoe said, the beginning of defensive. You told Amara with the expectation that Amara would tell everyone? Sophie said with the precision of a prosecutor making a narrow, accurate point. Sophie went back to her cinnamon roll. Zoe looked at him with the expression of someone testing a theory. Would you come to school? Zoe. Grace said the single word carrying several conversations at once. He said carefully, that's something your mom and I would have to talk about. Zoe processed this. He was learning an answer she accepted, not a yes, not a no, a thing to be worked out. She was practical that way. Okay, she said. But you're not supposed to build up expectations, he said, without talking to your mom first. She looked at him, then at Grace. Is that like the Amara thing? That's exactly like the Amara thing, Grace said. Zoe made a face that was part acceptance and part stored argument for a future conversation. Okay, they ate their pastries. The bakery filled up and thinned out around them, the Saturday morning crowd cycling through. At some point, Sophie asked him if he'd ever been to Iceland, and he said yes once for a conference. And she asked if he'd seen the Northern Lights, and he said no. He'd been there in August when it was too light at night, and her expression suggested she found this an unfortunate planning failure. Would you go back? She said. Probably, he said, in the right season. She said nothing more about it. But she looked at him in a way that suggested she was filing the information. Zoe, who had been listening, said, Sophie wants to see the Northern Lights. I know, he said. Zoe looked at Sophie, clearly having expected more of a reaction. Sophie was looking at her cinnamon roll. What do you want to see? He asked Zoe. She thought about this with genuine seriousness. The world's biggest pancake, she said. He blinked. It's a real thing, she said. There's a record. Someone made one. Mom showed me. I showed you it existed, Grace said. I did not suggest we needed to see it. But it's interesting, Zoe said. She looked at him. Don't you think that's interesting? It's a very large pancake, he said. It's remarkable, she said firmly. He looked at Grace. Grace was looking at her coffee cup again. He could see that the corner of her mouth was doing something. I'll concede remarkable, he said to Zoe. She looked satisfied. They sat in the bakery for another half hour. He noticed that Grace had relaxed, not completely, but measurably, the architecture of control having shifted slightly into something that was still careful, but less deliberate. She talked more easily. She told a story about a student in her class who had written a book report on a book he'd clearly never read, and the report was so specifically wrong in its wrongness that she suspected he'd described the book he'd wanted the book to be about instead. He laughed at this, genuinely, not performatively. She looked at him when he laughed, a brief look, the kind that registered something, and then moved on. He flew out Saturday afternoon. At the airport waiting at the gate, he opened his phone and looked at the photos he'd taken that morning at the park. He'd taken 3 Zoe on the swing, Sophie sitting on the bench with her geology book. One of all 3 of them at the bakery table that he'd asked the counter girl to take. In the bakery photo, Grace was looking at Zoe. Zoe was demonstrating something with her hands. Sophie was looking at Adrian with an expression that was still and attentive, and he thought evaluative. He had a folder on his phone for work project photos, whiteboard captures, building reference shots. He did not have a folder for personal photographs. He had not, he realized, taken a personal photograph in quite a while. He made a folder. He put the 3 photos in it and then sat with his phone in his lap and looked at the gate. He thought about what he knew. He knew that Grace had adopted 2 girls 4 years ago alone after the divorce. He knew that she'd moved to Portland and built a life there, a school, a neighborhood, a noodle place, a bakery with a regular table. He knew that Zoe was magnetic and direct and had built a narrative around a photograph, and that Sophie was quiet and precise and reserved her judgments. He knew that they were good. She'd told him that on the first sidewalk, and she'd been right, but knowing she was right and seeing it were different things. He knew that Grace had not told him about any of this, that for 4 years she'd been living this life, and he'd been living his in parallel in a country that was the same country, and that the overlap had been 0 until a bakery in October. He'd been in relationships since the divorce, 2 that lasted more than a year, a few shorter ones. He was not by any standard a person who had shut himself off from human contact. Just the thing he'd noticed increasingly was that the contact was surface area contact, professional proximity, social proximity. Nothing that went past the efficient outer layer of him. He thought about Grace laughing at the counter girl's story and then looking at him and looking away again. He thought about Sophie and the Northern Lights. He thought about Zoe's theory about the world's biggest pancake. His flight was called. He got on the plane. He put his phone away and looked out the window as Portland got smaller below him, the river and the bridges and the grids of streets, and somewhere down there in a house. On a street he didn't know. The address of two 7-year-olds were probably arguing about something or asking questions or reading books about places they wanted to go. He thought I would like to know what they're doing. This was new information. He sat with it. He called Grace on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the second visit. Not about anything in particular. He'd been in a meeting that had gone longer than expected and then had a gap before the evening call, and he'd dialed before he'd fully decided to. "Zoe has a cold," she said when she answered. "I'm home with her. Hold on." He heard movement. Then, "Okay, she's watching something. Is there something specific?" "No," he said. "I was just calling." A brief pause. "Just calling. Is that strange?" "No," she said slowly. "I'm trying to remember the last time you called without a reason." He thought about this. He couldn't recall it either. "How bad is the cold?" "Bad enough that she can't go to school. Good enough that she's been narrating her TV show to me for the past 2 hours." A pause. "She has opinions about a lot of fictional characters." "I believe it. She was very upset this morning because her stuffed rabbit's ear had a small tear in it, and she needed me to stitch it back immediately, despite the fact that my meeting started in 20 minutes. "Did you stitch it?" "I stitched it," Grace said with the tone of someone who does not regret this but would like the record to show it was inconvenient. He smiled. "Where's Sophie?" "School." "Sophie never gets sick. It's offensive." A pause. "She left this morning and told Zoe to feel better in a tone that meant, 'I'm going to have the whole room to myself for 8 hours. She covered her delight. "Barely." He could hear the warmth in it. "What's Zoe watching?" "An animated thing about a family of bears. It's actually quite good. I've seen parts of it approximately 40 times. A pause. "She wanted me to call you and tell you about the rabbit's ear." He stopped. "She wanted you to call me." "Yes." A slight pause. "I told her I'd mention it." He considered this. "She wanted you to call me about her rabbit's ear. She thought you'd want to know." He sat with this for a moment. The evening light outside his window was going long in bronze Manhattan, doing its late afternoon thing. He thought about Zoe in her bed, with a cold and a patched rabbit and a TV show, and the idea, which had apparently become a settled idea for her, that he was the kind of person who would want to know about her rabbit's ear. "Is it the yellow one?" he said. Grace was quiet for a second. "How do you know about the yellow rabbit?" she said. "She had it at the park. Both times. It was in her jacket pocket. I saw her check on it." Another pause. "She's had that rabbit since she was 3, Grace said quietly. "She brought it from the foster house. It's the one thing she's always had." He said nothing. "Her name for it is Carrot," Grace continued, "which Zoe has explained at length is because the rabbit likes carrots, not because the rabbit looks like one." "Of course," he said. "The ear's fine. I sewed it. It's good." She paused. "She'll be glad you asked. Tell her Carrot's tougher than she looks." He heard Grace not exactly laugh, but something adjacent to it. A small exhaling sound. "I'll tell her," she said. They talked for another 20 minutes. About nothing particular about her class, a math lesson that had gone sideways in a way that ended up being more useful than the planned lesson. About a restaurant in his neighborhood he'd eaten at twice and had mixed feelings about. About the acquisition briefly because she asked. He didn't plan the conversation. It went the way it went. When they hung up, he sat in his office in the evening light and thought about the last time he'd talked to someone for 20 minutes about nothing particular and had felt during those 20 minutes that the time was not being wasted. He couldn't place the last time. He was in Portland again in December for the acquisition closing. The paperwork took 2 days. He stayed at the same hotel. On Friday evening, Priya and her team took him to dinner at a place in the Pearl District that had very good food and no pretension about it. And they talked about the transition plan and about what came next. And he thought, as he often did at these moments, that the best part of his work was still the people, the ones who'd built something real and were trying to figure out how to keep it real after someone bigger moved in. He texted Grace from the hotel that evening. "Here through Sunday again. If this weekend works." No pressure. She replied an hour later, Saturday. The girls asked. "Meet us at the bakery at 9. He wrote back, "I'll be there." He was there at 8:58. The bakery, the bell, the warmth. They were already at the window table this time, the table where it had started. The same table, the same arrangement, except now Zoe turned when she heard the bell and spotted him, and sat up straight with the recognition of someone who'd been expecting a specific person. Sophie looked up from her book. Not the geology book this time, a bigger one, Grace had 2 coffees on the table. He sat down. The second coffee was apparently for him. He looked at it. "You take it black," Zoe said. "Mom told me." He looked at Grace, who was looking at her own coffee with a very neutral expression. "Thank you," he said. "I remembered," Zoe said, not modestly. "I have a good memory." "You do," Sophie said without looking up. "Zoe told her class about your company." "Sophie," Zoe said. "He should probably know. I barely said anything." "You explained artificial intelligence," Sophie said. Zoe made a face. "Ms. Patterson asked what our parents did, and I told her what you did, and she asked me to explain it more because the class was interested." He considered this. "What did you say?" "I said you make sure computers tell the truth." She looked at him. "Is that right?" "That's a reasonable summary," he said. "Amara said computers can't tell the truth because they're not alive. I said they can still say wrong things. Ms. Patterson said we were both right." She seemed satisfied with this outcome. Sophie turned a page. "What are you reading?" he said to Sophie. She held up the cover. It was a novel, a children's novel, but a real one, not an early reader. The cover had a girl running through a field on it. "Good," he said. She considered this with the seriousness she applied to most direct questions. "I've read the first part twice," she said. "Sometimes I do that. Make sure I understood it." "I do that too," he said. She looked at him. "With novels?" "With documents, reports. Sometimes I read the same paragraph 3 times to make sure I understood what it was actually saying." "Because the words can mean different things," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for another second, then back at her book. But something had shifted again, barely perceptible, the same millimeter movement he was coming to recognize. Grace was watching all of this over her coffee cup. When he glanced at her, she looked down, not quickly, just naturally. He thought, "She's watching them with me." He thought, "She's figuring out what this is." He was figuring out what this was too. He had not arrived at any conclusions. He had arrived at the following understanding. He drove to the airport on the weeks he was going to Portland with a quality of anticipation that he recognized without entirely naming. He checked his phone when he was in Portland more than he needed to. When he was back in New York, he found himself thinking about cinnamon rolls and pendulum books and yellow rabbits named Carrot. He was 53 years old, and he recognized this. He just wasn't sure yet what to do with the recognition. Zoe ordered another cinnamon roll. She offered him half of it with the ceremonial confidence of someone extending a significant gesture. He accepted. Sophie ordered nothing additional but ate 2 of his pastry pieces when he set the plate down between them. He noticed this. He said nothing. Outside the bakery window, the December Portland morning was doing what December Portland mornings did. Gray and cool, a light mist on the street, people in coats, moving with the focused efficiency of people trying to get somewhere warm. A child walked past, holding an adult's hand, looking up at something. The adult looked down. He watched this happen. Then he looked at the table at Zoe, who was explaining something to him with her hands again about the class's upcoming winter concert, about who was playing what instrument, about the fact that Sophie was playing violin and was very good but refused to admit it. Sophie was reading and not responding to this. Grace was listening to Zoe and occasionally adding a word and looking at him to see whether he was following. He was following. "Can you come to the concert?" Zoe asked. The table went quiet. The particular quiet of a question that had consequence. He looked at Grace. She looked at him. "When is it?" he said. "December 19th, Zoe said. "It's in the evening, 7 o'clock. Mom says I can invite whoever I want." He looked at Grace again. She held his gaze for a moment. She wasn't steering. She was watching him the same way she'd been watching all morning. "Tell me where," he said to Zoe, "and I'll see if I can make it work." Zoe looked at Sophie with the expression of someone who has accomplished something. Sophie kept reading, but her foot under the table swung once. End of part 2. He made it work. He rearranged a call, moved a dinner, asked his assistant to find him a flight that landed by 4 on the 19th. She did, looking at him over her laptop with the particular expression she wore when he did something that didn't fit his normal patterns, which she had cataloged over 8 years of working together. "Personal trip," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a half-second more. "Okay," she said, and booked the flight. He landed at PDX at 3:40. Took a car to the hotel, checked in, changed out of his travel clothes into a jacket that was less airport and more evening school concert, and took a cab to the address Zoe had texted him. She had texted him directly. He wasn't sure when she'd gotten his number, probably from Grace's phone with or without Grace's full awareness. The text had said it's the school on Clatsop Street parking is bad. You can walk from the coffee shop on the corner. Then a second text Sophie says to get there early because the second row is better than the first row. Sophie says the first row hurts your neck. He'd written back, "Thank you. Tell Sophie I'll take row 2." He got there at 6:45, which was early in the way Sophie had recommended. The school auditorium was filling up parents and grandparents and siblings, the specific warm noise of a room preparing for something small and important. A man near the door was handing out programs. He took one. Inside the winter concert, Roosevelt Elementary School listed in order of performance: 4th grade recorder ensemble, 3rd grade choir, 2nd grade rhythm band, 5th grade orchestra. He found Sophie Monroe under violin in the 5th grade orchestra section. 5th grade. He looked at that. Sophie was in 5th grade, which made her 10 or 11, not 7. He stood in the aisle of the auditorium and recalibrated. He had assumed the girls were 7 because Grace had said they were 3 when I brought them home 4 years ago, and he'd done the addition without checking his arithmetic. 3 plus 4 was 7. But at some point in those 4 years, a year had passed, and they'd turned 8 and then 9, and now they were 10. The girls were 10. He felt briefly the weight of the arithmetic. 3 years he'd assumed away. 3 more years of the life he hadn't known about. He found the second row. He sat down. He put his coat over the seat beside him. Grace arrived with Zoe at 6:52. He saw them come through the auditorium door, Grace in a dark coat with a scarf. Zoe in her good clothes with her hair done up, looking more formal and more uncomfortable than he'd ever seen her. She spotted him immediately, the way she always did, and her face did its fast, bright thing. She came over. Grace followed. He stood up. "You came," Zoe said. "I said I would." She sat down next to him with the same unself-consciousness she brought to everything. Grace sat on his other side, which was he noticed it and noted it and said nothing about it. "Sophie's nervous," Zoe said. "She didn't look nervous," he said. "Sophie never looks nervous, but I can tell." Zoe was looking at the program with an air of professional evaluation. "She practiced every night for 2 weeks, even when I was trying to sleep." "Was it loud?" "Violin is always loud," Zoe said. "It's a loud instrument." "It can be quiet," Grace said. "Not when Sophie practices," Zoe said. "She practices like she means it." He looked at the stage where the 4th graders were arranging themselves with the energetic chaos of children trying to hold still. He thought about Sophie in her room practicing her violin with the focused intensity she applied to everything while Zoe tried to sleep across the hall. Grace leaned in slightly, not close, just in. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly for him only. He looked at her. She was looking at the stage. "Of course," he said. The concert began. The 4th graders played Ode to Joy on recorders, which was both touching and technically approximate. The 3rd grade choir sang 2 songs with the particular combination of effort and abandon that characterized children's performances. Some of them very focused, some of them watching their parents in the audience. One girl in the back row who was clearly singing a different song entirely and seemed unbothered by this. Zoe watched with great attention, critiquing under her breath in a way she clearly thought was inaudible and was not. "Zoe," Grace said twice. Zoe adjusted. The 5th grade orchestra was last. They filed onto the stage in a way that was more disciplined than the younger group's older children holding their instruments with the particular practiced confidence of kids who had been told this was a performance and had taken it seriously. Sophie came out in the violin section. She was wearing a dark dress, and her hair was back, and her face was the same face it always was, still composed slightly apart. She took her place in the second chair of the first violin section and positioned her instrument and looked at the conductor. She did not look at the audience. She looked at the conductor, and when the conductor raised the baton, she raised her bow, and when they started to play, she played. He didn't know the piece. It didn't matter. What mattered was watching Sophie Monroe play violin, which she did with the same quality she brought to everything: focused, precise, completely present. She wasn't the best player in the section. He wasn't in any position to judge who was. But she was there. Every note completely there. Beside him, Zoe had gone entirely still. He glanced at Grace. She was watching Sophie with the particular expression of a parent watching a child do something they've worked at pride without sentimentality, the specific warm seriousness of it. He looked back at Sophie. The orchestra played 3 pieces. The last one he recognized vaguely, something classical that resolved in a way that felt complete. When they finished, the auditorium applauded and Sophie lowered her bow and looked at the audience for the first time. She found them in the second row. Him, Zoe, Grace. In that order, her gaze landed on him first and something in her face shifted. Something small and specific that he might not have noticed if he hadn't been watching carefully. Then she looked at Zoe, who was applauding with both arms and an expression of unbridled enthusiasm that was, he suspected, entirely genuine. Then at Grace. Grace smiled at her, not the controlled one, the full one. Sophie's face did something that wasn't quite a smile, but was the preparation for one. Afterward in the lobby, Zoe found Sophie. Before Sophie had finished putting her violin away and launched into a full report on what she'd observed from the second row. And Sophie accepted this with the weary patience of someone who had learned to receive Zoe at full volume. He hung back slightly while Grace went ahead to reach them. He stood in the lobby and watched the four of them, Grace hugging Sophie, which Sophie allowed with the air of someone accepting a formal recognition. Zoe talking, Sophie listening, Grace saying something to both of them. A family, he thought. That's what that is. He went over. Sophie looked at him when he reached them. She still had her violin case in her hand. "You played well," he said. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't know you were in 5th grade," he said. "I miscounted." She looked at him with the diagnostic expression. "We're 10, she said. "I realize that now. We've been 10 for 3 months. Happy belated," he said. She studied him for a moment. Then carefully, "Zoe wanted to invite you to the birthday. I told her it was too early." He absorbed this. That was probably right. "Yes," she said. "Not unkind, just accurate." Grace was watching this exchange. He met her eyes briefly. Zoe tugged his sleeve. "We're getting ice cream. Mom said we could because of the concert. Do you want to come?" He looked at Grace. She did the thing she did not steer, did not decline, did not push. Just waited. "Yes," he said. "I want to come." Zoe took his arm. Sophie picked up her violin case and walked ahead of them toward the door. Grace walked beside him. Outside the school, the December Portland evening was cold and clear. Stars not quite visible through the urban light, their breath-making small clouds. "She played well," he said to Grace quietly. "She's been working very hard," Grace said. "I could tell." They walked to the ice cream place, which was 3 blocks away, and which stayed open late because Portland was a city where ice cream in December was considered reasonable. Zoe ordered something complicated with 3 flavors. Sophie ordered vanilla, which she ate with the quiet contentment of someone who had decided what they wanted and was correct about it. He ordered coffee ice cream, which Zoe regarded as an adult choice, but did not disparage. Grace had a small cup of something and ate it slowly, listening to Zoe narrate the evening and occasionally looking at Sophie and occasionally looking at him. He thought, she's been doing this for 4 years. All of this. Every concert, every cinnamon roll, every patched rabbit ear. She's been doing this and it's been real and full and ordinary and extraordinary, and none of it required me. He thought, and yet here I am. He thought, and yet here she is letting me. He ate his coffee ice cream and listened to Zoe's report on the recorder section's performance, which was detailed and somewhat devastating, and watched Sophie finish hers in precise spoonfuls, and thought about what kind of person he wanted to be in this particular life that had opened up in front of him unbidden in a bakery in October. He didn't have an answer yet. He was for the first time in a long time comfortable not having the answer yet. He looked at Grace, who looked back at him, and they held that for a half-second before Zoe demanded his attention again. He gave it, willingly. January arrived with the specific cruelty of January, which was to say it arrived after a holiday season that had been alternately warm and lonely depending on the hour, and settled in for the long work of making everything gray and deliberate. He had not gone back to Portland in January. He had called twice, texted several times, received calls back. Zoe had called him once by herself from Grace's phone clearly, but without Grace in the room because the background was quiet in the way that meant whoever was watching did not want to be heard watching. She had told him that Sophie's violin teacher said Coffrey should consider auditioning for the youth symphony, and that Sophie had said she'd think about it, and that thinking about it was Sophie's way of deciding yes, but wanting more time, and that Zoe herself thought this was ridiculous, and Sophie should just say yes. "Did you tell her that?" he said. "I told her she was being dumb about it," Zoe said. "Zoe, she knew what I meant." He thought Sophie probably did know what she meant. How'd she take it? "She said I should mind my own business." A pause. "But then later she said she was going to think about the audition more seriously. So you were right." "I usually am," Zoe said. He had laughed at this. He'd been in his office a Tuesday afternoon and he'd laughed at a 10-year-old on the phone, and his assistant had looked up from her desk in the outer office with an expression of polite confusion. In February, Grace called him on a Wednesday evening. He was home, which was unusual for a Wednesday. A meeting had been moved, the evening had opened up. He'd made pasta from scratch, which was something he did when he had time, and which settled him in a way that most things didn't. He was cleaning up when she called. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Okay, I have a thing, a work event. A dinner, Saturday the 15th. It's the district's annual recognition dinner, and I was nominated for something which is—" She paused. "It's a thing. And I would normally ask my sister, but she's in London for 6 weeks, and I've arranged for the girls to go to a friend's family for the evening, but I wanted to ask." A pause. "Would you come to the dinner?" He was quiet for a moment. "It's not a she started. "I'll come," he said. A beat. "I was going to say it's not a romantic thing. I know. I just want company. Someone I don't have to explain things to." "I understand," he said. "You don't have to—" "Grace," he said. "I'll come. Tell me the time and address." She told him. He wrote it down. They talked for a few more minutes about other things he mentioned. The acquisition was fully closed and Priya was settling in, which Grace seemed glad to hear. And when he hung up, he stood at his kitchen counter and looked at the February night, out the window the city dark and lit all at once. He thought about someone I don't have to explain things to. He thought about how long it had been since he'd been that for anyone. The dinner was at a hotel ballroom in downtown Portland. He wore a suit which he rarely wore to anything that wasn't a board meeting, and he drove from his hotel and arrived at 7:15 because he'd become better at Portland traffic. Grace was at the bar when he got there with a glass of white wine and a woman he didn't know. She'd dressed up a navy dress, her hair slightly different than usual, the few gray threads catching the light. He noted this in the way he'd been noting things about her since the bakery, with the particular attention he gave to things that were worth understanding. She saw him across the room, and her face did something quick and unguarded, and then went back to normal. She said something to the woman beside her and crossed the room toward him. "You wore a suit," she said. "You said it was a dinner." "I meant a school dinner. It's not these are teachers, Adrian, not board directors." "Teachers deserve suits," he said. She looked at him for a second, and then she laughed, the real one, the one he'd heard at the park and been startled by. "Okay," she said. They had a glass of wine at the bar, and she introduced him to 3 colleagues. He was introduced as a friend from out of town, which was accurate and sufficient. He was good at professional social situations, which was to say he was good at asking questions that made other people feel interesting, and Grace's colleagues were interesting. A science teacher who was running a citizen research project with his 5th graders. A librarian who had started an after-school debate club because the kids kept arguing in the library anyway. At dinner, he sat next to her. The room was moderately loud with the specific sound of teachers at a voluntary dinner, which was warmer and less guarded than other professional occasions. He ate salmon and listened to the librarian on his left describe the debate club, and he asked the right questions, and occasionally he looked at Grace. She was nominated for the district's Teacher of the Year award. He found this out when the program started, and the MC read the names aloud, and hers was one of them. She hadn't mentioned this when she'd called it a thing. She'd said nominated for something, which he now understood was Grace doing what Grace did, which was to minimize the scale of her own accomplishments while attending to everyone else's with full attention. She didn't win. A 6th-grade science teacher from a school across town won, which appeared to be entirely deserved based on the citation, and Grace applauded with what seemed like genuine warmth. Afterward, in the car, he said, "You were nominated for Teacher of the Year." "I mentioned it," she said. "You said nominated for something." She looked out the passenger window. "It's been 3 years in a row. It stops feeling like it feels like something they do to say thank you without actually doing anything more useful, like giving teachers better pay. For example," a pause, "I don't need the recognition. It's nice, but I don't need it." "I know you don't," he said. "I think you should have it anyway." She was quiet for a moment. He drove her back toward her neighborhood, which was in a different direction from his hotel, and she directed him with occasional quiet turns until they were on a street of small houses with lit windows, rain wet in the February night. "This is it," she said. The house had a porch. It was modest and clear-lit and had a pot of dead plants on the porch that had not yet been cleared out, which was the sort of detail that meant someone had been meaning to do it for a while. He stopped at the curb. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said, "for coming. Thank you for asking." She was looking at him with the look that meant the thing she wasn't saying. Grace, he said. I know, she said. Don't. He didn't. She got out of the car. She stopped at the door to unlock it and turned back once briefly. Drive safe, she said. Good night, he said. He drove back to the hotel in the February rain and did not do anything except sit in his room and watch the news for an hour before sleeping. He thought that was probably right for now. In March, he asked Grace if he could take the girls to the Science Museum. Without me, she said. If you want to come, you should come. But I thought Sophie mentioned she wanted to go back, and Zoe mentioned a dinosaur exhibit. And if you have a Saturday, you'd like to yourself. Grace was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking from across the phone. You'd take both of them, she said, by yourself. Yes. You haven't, she paused. Adrian, you've never been alone with them. I know. You've met them 7 times. I know. A longer pause. Zoe will talk the entire time. I've noticed she does that. Sophie will want to read every single label on every single exhibit. I'll plan for that. Another pause. He could hear her making the calculation not about whether she trusted him, but about what the right amount of trust was and whether she'd gotten there yet. He held this patiently. He had learned in the past months that Grace's pauses were doing work. 4 hours, she said. I'll give you 4 hours. You pick them up at 10, you're back by 2. Okay? You have to text me when you get there and when you're leaving. Okay. And if Zoe gets overwhelmed, she sometimes does. In crowds, she goes quiet and then she gets upset and it comes out sideways. You bring her somewhere quiet and give her space. Don't push her to talk about it. Okay? Sophie will be fine. Sophie is always fine. Just let her set the pace in whatever exhibit she's interested in. Okay. She paused. You're very agreeable right now. I'm taking notes, he said. Another pause. Then, okay, she said. He picked up the girls at 9:58. They were ready, which he appreciated both in their jackets. Sophie with a small backpack she'd packed herself. He'd looked up the museum in advance, bought the tickets online, noted the exhibits, identified a cafe inside where they could stop if needed. In the car, Zoe sat in the front seat because Sophie declared she'd been carsick once on the way to a museum and didn't want to repeat. Zoe immediately adjusted his radio. Zoe, he said, what it's a traffic thing. It was on NPR. The voices are stressful, she said. People on NPR are always upset. He looked at the radio, which was now playing something he didn't recognize. What is this? My playlist, she said. He looked at her. She had the expression of someone who had prepared for this conversation. You can change it if you want, she said magnanimously. But this is better for driving. He drove to the museum with Zoe's playlist, which was, to his genuine surprise, not terrible. The museum was the kind of place designed to be both informative and stimulating, which meant it was busy on a Saturday morning, which meant crowds, which he'd accounted for. He positioned himself behind Sophie and Zoe at a slight distance close enough to be present, far enough to let them move at their own speed. Sophie's speed was careful and thorough. The geology section was first, and she read every label and asked him 2 questions he couldn't fully answer, and one he could, and when he couldn't answer, she accepted this with the equanimity of someone who understood that not every question had an available adult. We can look it up, he said. She nodded. She took a small notebook out of her backpack and wrote something down. He watched this. Do you do that often? When I want to remember something, she said. She kept the notebook in her hand for the rest of the geology section. Zoe's speed was faster and more associative. She moved between exhibits with the quick attention of someone who needed to see the whole thing before she could go back to any part of it. She talked constantly, observations, questions, follow-up observations that answered her own questions, responses to things she was reading on labels theories. He answered when he could and said, I don't know, when he couldn't, and she accepted this without breaking stride. In the dinosaur exhibit, she found the full skeleton of a triceratops and stopped cold. Oh, she said, very quietly, in a completely different register than her usual volume. He stood next to her. They looked at it together. It's big, he said. Not particularly. It's so old, she said. It's old in a way you can't really get. She paused. Like it lived and it died and now it's here, in the same building as me. She looked at the bones. Does that seem strange to you? He thought about it. Yes, he said. It seems very strange. She stood looking at it for a while. He waited. Sophie materialized at his other side without announcement and also looked at the skeleton. She said nothing. She stood with them. After a while, Zoe said, okay, and moved on. But she was quieter for the next 10 minutes, and he gave her the space for it, remembering what Grace had said about going quiet. At 11:30, they stopped at the cafe. He bought them both hot chocolates and got himself a coffee, and they sat at a small table by the window, and Zoe slowly came back to her usual volume, and Sophie opened her notebook and reviewed what she'd written. "You okay?" he said to Zoe. "Yeah," she said. "It just got me for a second." "That's okay. I think about dead things sometimes," she said. "Like, I think about things not being here anymore." He looked at her. She was saying this matter-of-factly as a report, not as distress. "That's a big thing to think about," he said. "I know. Therapist says it's normal." Sophie looked up from her notebook. Zoe looked at Sophie, then at him. "We both go," Zoe said. "We started when we were 8. Mom says it's healthy." She said this with the particular tone of a child who has had this conversation enough times to have a prepared answer. "It is healthy. I like it. My therapist has a really good fish tank." "Good fish tanks help," he said. Zoe seemed to decide this was an acceptable response. She picked up her hot chocolate. "Do you go to therapy?" "No," he said. "Mom says everyone should." She looked at him with her direct diagnostic way. "She didn't say you specifically. She says it in general. Your mom's probably right." "She usually is," Zoe said in an exact echo of something he'd said to her months ago. She didn't seem to notice the echo. Sophie was watching him. He met her eyes. She had the same evaluative look she'd had in the restaurant and the bakery at the concert. He was accustomed to it now. He understood it to be Sophie's process. She was deciding slowly and continuously what category he belonged in. He hadn't tried to influence this. He just kept being what he was, which was the only thing that seemed right. "Can we see the space stuff?" Sophie said. "There's a whole section," he said. I looked it up. She stood up. They spent the rest of the morning in the space and earth science exhibits. Sophie was in her element in a way he hadn't seen before. She moved with a slightly different energy. Here faster, her notebook filling up. She had opinions about the model of the solar system, about the exhibit, explaining tectonic plate movement, about the lack of a specific thing she'd read about in a library book and expected to see. "They should have more on igneous rock formation," she said. "You could write them a letter," he said. She looked at him. "Seriously, museums take public feedback." She considered this. She wrote something in her notebook. He thought Sophie Monroe is 10 years old, and she might actually write a letter to a science museum about igneous rock coverage. He thought, I hope she does. At 1:45, he texted Grace heading back. "Both intact," Grace wrote back. "Thank you for the precision." He drove them home. Zoe had resumed control of the music for the return trip and informed him she was selecting songs based on the vibe, which she described as satisfied. He asked her what satisfied sounded like, and she said, "Not stressful, comfortable, like you've seen enough for today, but in a good way." He drove through the Portland Saturday afternoon and thought that was a fairly good description of how he felt. He walked them to the door. Grace opened it before they reached it. She'd seen them pull up, probably. She looked at both girls. Both intact. "Good," she said. "The Triceratops was magnificent," Zoe said with great gravity, and went inside. Sophie stopped at the door. She looked at Adrian. Then she looked at Grace. Then she reached into her backpack and took out the small notebook and held it out to Grace. "He said I should write a letter to the museum about their exhibit gaps," she said. Grace took the notebook and looked at it. "About what gaps?" "Igneous rock formation, and a few other things." Sophie looked at Adrian once more. "He said museums take public feedback." A pause. "I think he's right." She went inside. Grace stood in the doorway with the notebook and looked at him. He couldn't quite read her expression. It was warm in a way that was also slightly unsteady, like something she hadn't prepared for. "She's going to write that letter," Grace said. "I know," he said. "You know how she is." "I'm starting to." Grace looked at him, then down at the notebook. "Come in," she said. "I made soup." He followed her inside. The inside of Grace's house was exactly what he might have predicted from the outside, and also completely surprising. The living room had books everywhere on shelves on the coffee table and a stack beside the couch. There were children's drawings on the refrigerator and a whiteboard on the kitchen wall where Grace appeared to keep the week's schedule. The couch had a throw blanket on it and a pillow that had been clearly reassigned from elsewhere. It was a house that was lived in, which was different from a house that was decorated. Zoe was already at the kitchen table pulling off her shoes and telling Sophie something about the Triceratops that Sophie was listening to with the specific patience of someone who had heard this twice, and knows they will hear it again. He sat down at the table and Grace brought him a bowl of soup, something with white beans and kale and a deep vegetable broth. He ate it, and it was good, the kind of simple good that required care in the building of it. "Sophie's going to write the letter," Zoe announced to Grace. "I see that." She showed him her notebook. "She did." Zoe looked at him. "Sophie doesn't show people her notebook," she said. "Usually." He said nothing. He ate his soup. Sophie was eating her soup across from him with her notebook open beside her bowl. She was reviewing what she'd written, adding things. "Sophie," Zoe said. "What?" "You showed him your notebook." Sophie looked at her soup. "I know. You never show people your notebook." "I know." A pause. He said useful things. Zoe seemed to find this satisfying. She looked at Adrian. "She likes you," she said. "Zoe," Grace said. "She does," Zoe said unapologetically. "It's a compliment." Sophie's spoon went very still for a second. Then she resumed eating. He did not look at Sophie. He looked at his soup bowl. "The soup is excellent," he said to Grace. She was looking at him with the slight sideways quality that meant she was managing several things at once. "It's from Tuesday," she said. "It's always better on day 3. The flavors." "Yes." She sat down with her own bowl. "Do you cook?" "Some," he said. "Pasta. A few other things." "Zoe, don't put your feet on the chair." Zoe put her feet down. "What kind of pasta?" Zoe said. "Several kinds. I made fresh pasta last month, and it took 3 times as long as it should have." "Fresh pasta," Zoe said with the interest of someone who has identified a useful skill. "From scratch. You roll it out. Does it taste different than regular pasta?" "Yes." She looked at him with the expression that meant she was filing this for future use. Sophie had looked up from her notebook without appearing to. "Can you teach me?" Zoe said. "If your mom's okay with it," he said. Grace was eating her soup with the expression of someone who has lost control of a situation in a way that is not entirely unwelcome. "We'd need a pasta machine," Zoe said. "Or you could bring yours." "Zoe, what I'm planning." "You're planning in a direction you haven't been given permission to plan in." Zoe considered this. "Can I plan in that direction?" "We'll see," Grace said. "Eat your soup." Zoe ate her soup, but she was clearly planning. He stayed for another hour. Sophie finished her soup and went to her room, returning 10 minutes later with a library book she sat on the couch to read. Zoe stayed at the table and asked him about New York, about the biggest building he'd ever been in, about whether he had a car in New York, about what he ate for breakfast, about whether he got lonely. That last question arrived at the end of the others without warning or particular emphasis, just the next thing she wanted to know. "Sometimes," he said. She thought about this. "I get lonely too," she said. "Even when people are around. Is that the same thing?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I think that's exactly the same thing." She nodded as if he'd confirmed something she'd suspected. Then she moved on to asking about the pasta machine, and he answered, and Grace refilled his coffee without asking, and Sophie turned a page and the afternoon went on. He drove back to his hotel at 5. He sat in the room for a while, and then he called his sister in Seattle, who he talked to 3 or 4 times a year and who always said some version of, "You sound different," when he called. "You sound different," his sister said. "I'm in Portland." "Why are you in Portland?" He told her. "Not all of it, but enough." There was a long silence after. "Adrian," she said. "I know," he said. "Are you being careful?" "I'm trying." Another silence. "That's not a no." "No," he said. "It's not a no." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her husband's voice in the background, something domestic and distant. "I've been hoping for something like this," she said, "for a long time." He didn't answer. I always liked Grace," she said. "Even after. A pause. "Just be careful, for all of you." "I know," he said. After he hung up, he sat in the hotel room and looked at the Portland evening outside the window. The sky had the lavender gray quality that came just after the sun went behind the clouds for good. He thought about careful. He thought about the museum and the soup and Sophie's notebook and Zoe's question about loneliness. He thought about Grace putting a second coffee cup on the table without asking. He thought about the fact that he'd driven home from 4 different visits to this city with the particular feeling of something becoming real, and that each time was slightly more real than the last, and that this was either the best thing that had happened to him in a long time or something he needed to handle with a great deal of care. Possibly both. He looked at his phone. He had not texted Grace since dropping the girls off. He should probably something easy, a closing note on the day. He sat with the phone in his hand and tried to find something that wasn't too much and wasn't too little and didn't require her to respond to something she might not be ready to respond to. He typed, "Good day. Thank you for the soup." She wrote back after a while. "They both talked about you through dinner, even Sophie in her way." He looked at this for a long time. Then he wrote, "Tell them I'll bring the pasta machine next time." She wrote back. "Sophie already mentioned it. Zoe announced it as a plan." He smiled at his phone in a hotel room in Portland at 6:30 on a March Saturday. He thought, "I didn't know this was coming. I didn't know any of this was coming." He thought, "I'm glad it is." April. He made good on the pasta machine. He brought it on the trip in early April, a somewhat absurd thing to carry through an airport. The box in his carry-on taking up more space than it should, earning him a look from the TSA agent who opened his bag and found it nested between his laptop and his dress shoes. "Pasta maker," he said. The agent looked at it. "Okay," she said, as if this was only mildly the strangest thing she'd encountered. He drove to Grace's house on Saturday morning. Both girls were at the kitchen table when he arrived, which meant they'd been waiting, which he didn't mention because pointing it out would embarrass Zoe, who had the dignity of someone who never admitted to looking forward to things. He set the box on the counter. Zoe looked at it with professional interest. "That's the pasta machine," she said. "That's the pasta machine. It's smaller than I imagined. It does what it needs to do." He looked at Grace, who was leaning against the counter with her coffee. "Do you have flour?" "I got flour yesterday," Grace said with the tone of someone who has been asked to obtain materials for something she had reservations about and decided not to have the reservations. "Eggs?" "Yes." "Salt." "Adrian," she said, "I teach 3rd grade. I have salt." Zoe laughed. They made pasta. He had not made pasta in front of other people before. He developed the habit alone in his kitchen on weekend evenings when he had time and wanted something that required attention. He knew the ratios, knew the feel of the dough when it was right, knew how long to rest it. What he had not accounted for was making it in a kitchen with 2 10-year-olds who had entirely different approaches to tasks. Zoe wanted to do everything simultaneously. She measured flour and also cracked an egg, and also asked 3 questions, and the dough started crumbly and too dry because she'd added the flour before the eggs had fully incorporated, and she'd moved on before checking. "Slow down," he said. "I'm not in a rush." "You are," he said. "You're in a rush in the way that people are in a rush when they're excited. I do the same thing. You have to slow down." She looked at her dough. "It's not right. It's fixable," he said. "Add a little water." Slowly. She added the water. He showed her the pressure, the heel of the hand, the fold, the turn. She did it wrong twice, and then she did it right, and she looked at her hands. "Oh," she said. "There it is," he said. Sophie was working on her own ball of dough with the meticulous patience she brought to everything. She'd read the recipe card he'd written out 3 times before starting and was following it like a technical document. Her dough came out perfect. He said so. She looked at it. "It didn't feel right at first," she said. "It was too sticky." "What did you do?" "Kept working it. You said the dough tells you when it's ready." He had said that. He'd said it in passing, checking on Zoe, and Sophie had been listening. Grace made the sauce a simple one. Tomatoes and garlic and basil from a pot on the windowsill she'd been keeping alive since February. She worked around the 3 of them at the counter with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to cook in a kitchen that was not designed for 4 people. He threaded the dough through the machine, showing them both. The sheets came out thin and translucent, edged the real pasta color, and Zoe made a sound of appreciation that was entirely unironic. "That's it," she said. "That's the thing. That's pasta. It's different. Wait until you eat it." They boiled water and cooked the pasta and ate it at the table with Grace's sauce and a salad she'd made and bread from the bakery that Sophie had been dispatched to pick up earlier in the morning. It was 11:30 in the morning, which was a slightly unusual time for pasta, but nobody mentioned this. It was, he thought, the best meal he'd eaten in years. Not because of the pasta, which was good, because of the table and the people at it, and the particular ordinary quality of it, the flour still on the counter, and on Zoe's sleeve, and one of the pasta sheets that had been declared too uneven for eating, now acting as a bookmark in Sophie's book. Zoe ate 2 full portions and part of a 3rd. "You're going to feel like that," Grace said, gesturing at Zoe's plate. "I already feel like that," Zoe said contentedly. Sophie ate 1 portion and then sat with a small second helping she'd served herself with the measured precision of someone who had decided exactly how much more she wanted. He ate and listened to Zoe report on the previous week's events at school, and Grace add corrections and context to Zoe's account, She says the teacher, like she wasn't standing 3 feet away. And Sophie occasionally offer a single clarifying sentence that reframed everything. He thought about the morning in Denver, the birthday, the hotel lobby breakfast. He thought about Gerald in his lobby saying good evening and the particular echo of the marble floor. He thought I was very far from this. He thought I am not far from this anymore. He didn't say any of this. He passed the bread. The first time he picked them up from school, it was because Grace had a parent-teacher conference that ran late. She'd called him at 2:30. I know this is... What do you need? He said. The girls get out at 3:15. I'm stuck in a conference it's one of those. A pause. Do you know the school? I know the street. The pickup is on the east side, the parking lot they'll only release to people on the authorized list. Your name's on it. I added it last month. He absorbed this. She'd added him to the list last month before she needed to use it. I'll be there, he said. He was there at 3 o'clock. The school was familiar from the December concert, different in the afternoon light. The parking lot filling up with parents in a pattern he didn't know, but which he understood to have rules, so he parked where it seemed permitted and stood near the designated pickup area. Zoe saw him before he saw them. She was in a group of kids moving through the double doors talking to a girl he didn't know, and then she looked up and spotted him and said something to the girl and changed direction. You came, she said. Your mom asked me to. Zoe looked at him with the evaluating look. She said you would. Sophie arrived 2 minutes later, emerging from the school with her backpack and a folder she was carrying carefully. She saw him and stopped for a moment, adjusting to this information, and then walked over. Mom's late, she said. Conference, he said. She nodded. She stood beside him without the awkwardness you might expect just standing. He signed them out at the window, which required showing ID, which required the woman at the window to compare his face to his license, and then to the list on her screen with the careful attention of someone who took this responsibility seriously. He approved of this entirely. They walked to his car. Zoe put her bag in the back and got in the front. Sophie got in the back without comment. He drove. How was school? He said. Because that was what you said. Normal, Zoe said. Good or normal? Normal is good, she said. Bad days are abnormal. Today was normal. She seemed to consider this a complete answer. Sophie, he said. Fine, Sophie said from the back. We had a thing in science about ecosystems. Good. I already know most of it, she said, but sometimes knowing it and hearing it taught are different. You notice things you didn't notice before. He thought about this. That's true, he said. She was quiet for a moment. I wrote the letter, she said. He glanced at the mirror. To the museum. Yes. Last week. Mom helped me address it. I don't know if they'll respond. They might, he said. If the letter is specific and polite, they usually at least acknowledge it. It was specific, she said in a tone that closed the question of whether the letter had been specific. He drove. Zoe had found a song she liked and turned it up 2 notches and then glanced at him. It's fine, he said. She left it. They got back to the house. He unlocked it with the key Grace had given him also last month, also in advance of needing it, which he thought about for a second while the door swung open. Sophie went to her room. He heard the violin a few minutes later, not practicing properly. More like warming up scales and then something exploratory. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop planning to work and instead listened. Zoe came downstairs with a worksheet and sat across from him. Homework, he said. Math, she said with the tone of someone approaching something distasteful. What kind? Fractions. She put the worksheet on the table. I hate fractions. What part? The dividing part. It doesn't make sense. He looked at the worksheet. 4th grade fractions dividing a fraction by a fraction. He remembered distantly the particular confusion of this. Okay, he said. I can show you a way to think about it. She looked at him with the suspicion of someone who had been shown math in unhelpful ways before. Is it the way the teacher shows it? Maybe, he said. Or maybe different. Sometimes 2 ways are better than 1. She pushed the worksheet toward him. He explained. Not the algorithm first, but the logic. What does it mean to divide something into parts? What does asking how many halves are in 3/4 actually mean? He drew small pictures on the edge of the worksheet because he was better at showing than explaining. Zoe watched. She interrupted twice, which meant she was following because she only interrupted when she was engaged. He adjusted. After about 8 minutes, she looked at the first problem and did it herself. She got it right. She looked at it, then at him, then back at it. Oh, she said in exactly the same tone she'd used looking at the pasta dough. There it is, he said. She worked the rest of the worksheet in 12 minutes. He checked it. 3 small errors which he circled lightly in pencil with a question mark instead of an X. She fixed them. Show your work on that one, he said, just so your teacher can follow the thinking. She wrote out the steps. When Grace arrived home at 4:40, slightly flushed from the conference and from walking fast, she found Adrian at the kitchen table with his laptop and Zoe across from him with her finished homework, and from upstairs the sound of Sophie's violin moving through a passage that sounded deliberate and focused. Grace stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked up. She looked at the homework, at him, at Zoe, who had already started talking about the fractions. She said nothing for a moment. Soup's still warm, he said. She put her bag down. I know, she said quietly. Not about the soup. She hung up her coat. She sat down at the table. And she didn't say the thing she was feeling the way she always didn't say the thing she was feeling, but he was beginning to understand what the silence meant when it looked the way that particular silence looked. He got up and got her a bowl of soup. She didn't argue. The violin upstairs moved into something more lyrical, something with a phrase that came back twice, and the late afternoon settled into evening. In the kitchen, where they sat, Grace eating soup and Zoe explaining fractions she now felt she had mastered. And outside, the Portland spring was starting to make itself known in the particular way of places that earned their spring slowly, with effort turning green before they were fully ready. He stayed for dinner that night, and 3 more after it over the next weeks, each time arriving, because there was a reason, and staying because the reason became the evening, and the evening became natural. It was a gradual thing, the way gradual things are not a threshold crossed, but a series of moments that accumulated until the accumulation had a name you didn't need to say aloud. He knew what was happening. He was not going to rush it. He understood with a particular clarity that came from having been married once to the same person that what was happening required the time it was taking. Grace was not withholding. She was being careful in the way you were careful when the last time you hadn't been careful had cost you a great deal. He respected this. He even understood it. What was harder to manage was the way he felt in the moments that were ordinary, driving the girls to school, sitting in her kitchen on a Tuesday evening when she was grading papers and he was working at the table and Zoe came downstairs for water and saw them both and said, "Oh, good, you're both here," as if this were a condition she'd been hoping to find, and then went back upstairs. The way Grace had looked at him across the table after that. He could have said something. He didn't. He went back to his laptop. She went back to her papers. The house was quiet. He thought about that moment in the car on the way back to the hotel. He thought about it the next day and the day after. He was 53 years old, and he was sitting with something he wasn't saying, and it was, he realized, entirely foreign to him. He had built his professional life on precision and directness, on saying the thing that needed to be said. He had failed in his marriage to apply this to the personal. The late nights, the canceled dinners, the times Grace had looked at him with the look she was trying not to show, and he'd known and not addressed it because addressing it would have required a conversation he didn't know how to start. He'd done it with distance then. He wasn't going to do it with distance now. But he was also not going to push, not because of timidity, because he understood in a way that was new to him that this was not something you could build by moving faster. You could only build it by showing up, by being consistent, by being... He was going to have to use the word present. It was harder than he'd expected being present. It required things he'd gotten out of the habit of staying instead of leaving. Listening past the point where he had enough information to respond, being in a room that was loud with children and homework and violin, and not counting the hours until he could be quiet. He was getting better at it. In May, Grace said very carefully on a Thursday evening, when the girls were asleep and they were sitting on her porch with tea, "I want to talk about what this is." He looked at her. She had her hands around her mug. She was looking at the small porch railing at the dead plant pot that was no longer entirely dead. Something had started coming back in. It a small green shoot he'd noticed 2 weeks ago and mentioned, and Grace had looked at it with the expression of someone surprised to find it had survived. "Okay," he said. I don't want to define it formally. That's not what I mean." She paused. "I mean that the girls they've started relating to you in a way that I want to be intentional about. Zoe told her therapist about you. Sophie has apparently mentioned you to her teacher." A beat. Mrs. Patterson told me Sophie described you as a consistent adult in her life. He absorbed this. That's Sophie language for something significant, Grace said. I figured, he said. So I need to know. She stopped. I need to know whether you're here. She looked at him. Not here for the acquisition. Not here because you're in Portland sometimes and it's easier to stay connected than not to. Actually, here. For them. For them, he said. Yes. For them first. She looked at him steadily. Everything else can figure itself out. But they need to know someone is choosing to be here for them, not as a romantic strategy or because. She stopped again. I need you to be here for the right reasons. He set down his own mug. He looked at her face. She was doing the careful thing, the architecture, but underneath it, he could see what it cost her to ask this, the particular exposure of asking someone to account for their intentions. When accounting for someone's intentions had not historically gone well. I'm here for them, he said. I'm also here for you. I'm not going to pretend those are separate things because they're not, and you know that. But if you're asking whether they come first, yes, they do. And not because that's what you need to hear, because they're, he paused, choosing words with care. They're real to me. Zoe and Sophie are real to me in a way that has nothing to do with strategy. Grace was quiet. I know that doesn't fully answer it, he said. I know the question is also about consistency, about what happens when my board wants me back, about whether I'm the kind of person who can actually. He stopped. I don't know how to prove that except by doing it. I know, she said. I'm asking you to trust me a little further, he said. Not all the way, just a little further. She looked at her mug for a long time. Then she said, okay, not a declaration, not a reassurance, just okay. He nodded. They sat on the porch in the May evening. A dog barked somewhere down the street. The green shoot in the dead pot swayed slightly in the breeze. He thought this is the right pace. He thought, I'm learning it. He stayed in Portland that weekend, not at a hotel this time, but in the guest room at his sister's friend's place, a favor arranged through the kind of mutual contact logic that cities developed when you'd been spending time in them long enough to accrue people who knew people. The point was he was in Portland for 2 nights, and he spent most of Saturday with Grace and the girls. And Saturday evening, he sat on the porch again while Grace put them to bed, and when she came back out, she sat in the other chair and they talked for almost 2 hours. This was new. Not the porch they'd sat on the porch before. The 2 hours. The conversation that was not about anything specific and was about everything that moved from Zoe's reading to his early career to the school where Grace had first taught to the city, where they'd lived when they were married, to the way she'd come to Portland. Not through a plan, but through a colleague's recommendation at a conference, and she'd driven up for a weekend and walked around for 3 days and gone back to pack. You knew immediately, he said. I knew when I found the house, she said. I was walking and I turned the corner on that street and the porch had the dead plants already on it. And I thought, she paused. I thought I could fix those. And you did. Eventually, she looked at the pot that was now in the May evening fully alive. It took most of a year. Some things do, he said. She looked at him. He looked at the street. They talked about the girls, specifically about the question of what they understood about their adoption, what questions had come up, what Grace had navigated. She talked about it carefully, not as performance, but as reflection, the way you talked about the hard parts of something that had been worth every hard part. Zoe asked me once if she was broken, Grace said. She was 6. She'd heard something at school about foster children. She came home and sat down at the table and said, Am I broken? And I said, no. And she said, How do you know? And I said, because I chose you. And she said, people choose broken things sometimes. And I said, she stopped. I said, the choosing is what makes something whole, not the thing itself. The choosing. He looked at her. She thought about it for a while, Grace said. Then she ate her dinner. She didn't ask again. Did you think about it again? He said. Every day for 3 months, she said. Whether I'd said the right thing, whether I'd. She shook her head slightly. You second-guess everything. There's no rule book. You did fine, he said. I did my best, she said. That's different. Is it? She looked at him. Yes, she said. Fine means it worked out correctly. Best means you tried with everything you had. I can only speak to the second one. He thought about this. He thought about the things he had not tried with everything he had, the years when the company had been the most demanding thing, and everything else had been managed around it, the way he'd managed Grace around it. The particular failure of the kind of person who was excellent at the large things and careless with the small ones. I wasn't always my best, he said, in the marriage. She was quiet. I wasn't bad, he said. I just wasn't there, not in the way that mattered. No, she said. You weren't. He sat with the agreement. We were both, she paused. We both stopped saying things. That was the problem, I think. Not one person's failure. The language went away. She looked at the street. I don't know when. I don't either, he said. A pause. I've been different this year, he said. I can feel it. I notice things I didn't used to notice. He stopped. I call my sister now. I called her in February. She cried. Grace looked at him. I don't know what changed, he said. Or I do know, and I'm trying to put it in words, and the words aren't. He paused. Something about walking into a room and finding that a child you didn't know was waiting for you. She looked at the pot with the plant in it. She wasn't waiting for you, Grace said. She was just herself, curious, constructing theories. I know, he said, but it felt like being found. I know that's projecting something onto her, but that's what it felt like. Grace was quiet for a long time. She told me, she said finally, when I asked her why she said what she said in the bakery. A week later I asked her. She paused. She said he looked like he was looking for something. He said nothing. She's 7, Grace said. 10. She was 10. She had a theory and she slotted you in. Maybe, he said. But not entirely wrong, Grace said. Not entirely wrong, he agreed. The night was coming in properly now, the sky going dark in the way that May skies in Portland did slowly and gently. The street was quiet. Someone walked a dog past. 2 blocks away, the bakery was probably closing the green awning pulled in. What happens now, he said. I don't know, she said. But you're not trying to end it. No, she said. I'm not trying to end it. A pause. I'm trying to be careful with it. I know the difference, he said. I know you do, she said. The porch was quiet. The night held them. He thought I will be careful with it too. He thought I will show up for the small things. He thought I know how to do that now. He hadn't known how to do that before. That was the truth of it, the actual truth that sat underneath everything. He had not known for most of his life that the small things were the main things. He had thought the main things were the large ones, the decisions, the achievements, the structures built, and the problems solved. He had not understood that what mattered was being there when someone made pancakes, being there when the violin started upstairs, being there for the rabbit's ear and the fractions and the school concert in the second row. Being there. He was there. He was going to keep being there. He looked at Grace, who was looking at the street, and he thought she was always this person. She was always the person who knew which things were the right ones to protect. He had needed all of this, the years, the loss, the bakery, the October light to get there himself. He was grateful for it. He was genuinely, simply grateful. The email arrived on a Monday morning in late June. He was in his New York office at his desk by 7:15, the way he always was, working through the morning quiet before the building filled up. The acquisition was fully integrated. Priya had presented her first quarterly report 2 weeks ago, and it had been strong. He was, by the metrics he'd built his professional life around, at the top of what he'd made. The email was from Hargrove, who was the board's lead independent director and had been for 6 years, and whom Adrian respected as a businessman and found personally requiring in the way that certain capable people could be. The subject line was Proposed Strategic Expansion Request for Discussion. He read it twice. The substance was this. The board had been in conversations with a major European AI governance consortium, a body that had recently been given significant regulatory authority across the EU. The consortium was looking for an American partner, not an acquisition, a structural partnership, a joint entity that would require significant U.S. presence, significant travel, significant Adrian as the face. The timeline was aggressive. The window for negotiating the partnership terms was 18 months starting now, during which period the board's expectation was that Adrian would relocate to Brussels for extended periods, 3 months minimum, possibly more, and that he would be the primary representative of the company in what would effectively be the most significant strategic move in the company's history. Hargrove's note was well-written and professional and enthusiastic in the measured way of people who are making a case they believe in. He laid out the opportunity carefully. He noted the obvious fit with Adrian's own founding vision, AI ethics, accountability, governance. He mentioned that the board had the full support of the 3 other independent directors. He mentioned that this would put the company in an unparalleled position for the next decade. He mentioned that they needed an answer within 3 weeks. Adrian set down the email. He looked at his desk. He looked at the Manhattan morning outside his window. He had not until this moment fully understood how much things had changed. 6 months ago, maybe 8. He would have read that email and felt something quicken. Not quite excitement, but the professional version of it. The part of him that had always been activated by exactly this kind of thing. The consequential decision, the significant platform, the vision made real. He would have started thinking through the structure immediately. The negotiating strategy, the right people to put in rooms. He still understood why it was a significant opportunity. He wasn't having trouble with the analysis. He was having trouble because he'd had dinner at a small house in Portland 4 days ago, and Zoe had been working on a project about Oregon geography that she'd spread across the kitchen table, and Sophie had come home from what turned out to be a trial rehearsal with the youth symphony she'd finally auditioned for, and she'd been not visibly happy. Sophie was never visibly happy, but she'd been the quiet version of it. The way her shoulders sat differently when something had gone right, and he'd helped Zoe trace the Columbia River on her map, and driven Sophie to get ice cream because Grace had said she deserved it, and Sophie had said she didn't need to be celebrated for a rehearsal, and Grace had said this was not about need, and Sophie had gone for the ice cream. He'd been in that car, and he'd watched Sophie order vanilla again, and he'd thought, I can't relocate to Brussels for 3 months. He had not said this out loud. He was thinking it now sitting in his office, holding the weight of it. He called Hargrove. Hargrove picked up on the second ring. Adrian, you read it. I read it, he said. Tell me what we're actually talking about. They talked for 45 minutes. Hargrove was thorough and honest and made the case well. The window really was limited. The consortium really was significant. The upside was genuinely exceptional. By the time they'd finished, he understood the opportunity clearly, completely. He also understood that it was incompatible with what he was building in Portland. He did not say this to Hargrove. He said he needed to think and would respond by the end of the week. He sat at his desk for a while after the call. His assistant knocked and asked about his 9 o'clock, which he confirmed. He went to the meeting. He was present in the meeting, functional, attentive. He came back and sat at his desk and looked at the email again. He called Grace at noon Portland time. She was at school. She didn't pick up. He left a message saying nothing important, just that he'd called. She called back at 3:15. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Why, you called at noon. You don't call at noon. He was silent for a moment. She was right. He didn't call at noon. There's a thing at work, he said. I need to tell you about it. A pause. I'm picking up the girls in 10 minutes. Can we talk tonight? Yes, he said. He called at 8:30 when the girls were in bed. He told her the full thing, Hargrove, the consortium, the timeline, what the board wanted. She listened without interrupting. When he'd finished, she was quiet for a moment. What are you thinking? She said. I'm thinking I don't want to do it, he said. But I haven't made a decision. I wanted to tell you first. Why first? Because it affects... He stopped. Because what's happening in Portland it's the most important thing I have. I want you to know the decision is being made in that context. Another pause. Adrian, I'm not telling you for approval, he said. I'm not asking you to influence the decision. I wanted you to know that it exists as a factor, that you're a factor. The girls are a factor, she said carefully. You're all a factor. He waited. Is that all right? She was very quiet. I need to say something, she said finally. Okay. I don't want to be the reason you don't do something you should do, she said. I did that once. Not with you. With myself. I stayed in a situation I should have left because I thought leaving would hurt someone, and it... She paused. I'm not going to be the thing that limits you. I refuse to be that for you. He sat with this. That's not what this is, he said. You can't know that yet. Yes, I can, he said. I know the difference between ambition and what I'm building here. I built that company for 23 years because I believed in it. I still believe in it, but I also know what I was in those years. I know what I was missing. He paused. The Brussels thing. It's the kind of thing I would have been excited about at 40. At 45, maybe even at 50. But I'm 53 and something's different. What's different? I know what the things that feel important are actually worth, he said. She didn't say anything. I'm not asking you to decide anything, he said. I'm not asking you for anything. I just want to do this right. I want to make the decision and have it be made for the right reasons, not just the most convenient ones. She said slowly, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to talk to Hargrove again," he said. "And then I'm going to figure out if there's a structure that doesn't require me to be gone for 3 months. And if there isn't, then I'm going to decide based on what matters." She was quiet for a long time. "Okay," she said. "Okay, okay," she said again, measured. "But Adrian, whatever you decide it for you. Not for me, not for the girls. You understand?" "I understand," he said. He wasn't entirely sure he agreed, but he understood what she was asking. He spoke to Hargrove twice more that week. He laid out clearly what he was willing and not willing to do. He could be the lead representative for the partnership. He could negotiate the structure. He could fly to Brussels for 2-week periods, perhaps 4 or 5 times in the 18-month window. He could not do 3 months minimum. Hargrove listened. He said he'd take it to the other directors. On Thursday, the full board call happened. He presented his alternative structure. He was direct about his reasons, not personal details, but the substance that he had commitments in Portland that constituted a priority he was not willing to restructure, and that within those constraints, he believed he could execute this partnership. Director Almeida said, "You've been different this year, Adrian. We've all noticed." He considered this. "Different how?" "Less available," she said. "Not critical, just descriptive. More settled." He looked at the conference room wall. "Yes," he said. "That's probably accurate." Hargrove said, "We're not trying to take something from you. We want to make sure we can get what we need." "I know," Adrian said. "Here's what I can give you." He walked them through the modified structure again. He watched the faces on the call, attentive, considering. These were people who had seen him perform at a high level for a long time and trusted his judgment. They were not going to dismiss what he was proposing. After 30 minutes, Director Park said, "If the modified structure gets us the partnership, it gets us the partnership. I want the partnership." A silence. "So do I," Director Almeida said. Hargrove looked at him from the screen. "You'd be our primary face. 2 weeks in Brussels, 4 times over 18 months. You'd have to be present." "I'm present," Adrian said. Another pause. "Okay," Hargrove said. "Modified structure. We'll need it fully documented by end of next week." Adrian said, "Done." He sat in his office after the call and felt something that he recognized as the satisfaction of a problem solved, but quieter than usual, less distinct. Because the problem solved was not the Brussels opportunity. The problem solved was keeping the Brussels opportunity from becoming the thing that broke what he'd been building. He called Grace. "It's modified," he said when she picked up. 2-week trips 4 times. I can do it without it's not the full ask." She was quiet for a moment. "You kept it." "Yes." "You pushed back on the board." "I proposed an alternative structure." "They took it." "You pushed back on the board," she said again, with a different emphasis. He understood what she meant. She meant that it was not a small thing to tell a board no, even a partial no, even a no wrapped in an alternative. She meant that she understood this. "Yes," he said. "I did." She said nothing for a moment. "Adrian," she said, "thank you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." A pause. "The girls are at a sleepover tonight. It's quiet here." "Is it nice?" She seemed to consider this. "It's strange," she said. "I've been doing this for 4 years. The quiet should feel familiar, but tonight it feels—" She stopped. "It just feels quiet." "I'll be in Portland next week," he said, "for the documentation meeting." "I know." "I could bring food," he said. "If you want. Whatever you want. It doesn't have to be—" "Dinner," she said. "I'll make dinner. You can bring wine." He smiled at his office wall. "Okay," he said. 7 o'clock, she said. "The girls will be home." 7 o'clock, he said. He hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of his New York office, 23 floors above Manhattan, the city doing its June evening thing outside the windows. He thought about the board call and about Hargrove's face when he'd said the modified structure would work. He thought about Director Almeida saying more settled. He thought about the word settled. He had been restless for so long. Not unhappy exactly, but restless in the deep-seated way of a person who has organized their life around motion and found that motion at a certain point is just another word for not arriving anywhere. He was starting to arrive somewhere. He turned back to his computer. He had documentation to write a partnership structure to formalize 8 other things that needed his attention. He worked for 3 more hours. At 9:30, he turned off his desk lamp and took the elevator down and walked out into the New York night, which was warm and loud and alive, and found his car, and drove to his apartment and ate the leftover pasta he'd made on Sunday. and watched nothing on television and went to bed and slept better than he had in months. He brought the wine on Tuesday evening, a good one from a place in the West Village he went to when he needed a thoughtful recommendation, and arrived at Grace's house at 3 minutes to 7. The girls were home. Zoe opened the door. "You brought wine," Zoe said. "For your mom," he said. She looked at the bottle with the evaluative expression. "Is it good?" "I think so. Mom says she can tell bad wine from a mile away." "I believe that," he said. Zoe stepped back to let him in. The house smelled of garlic and something slow-cooked. The particular warm smell of real cooking, not the efficient kind, but the kind that meant someone had started something in the afternoon and let it find itself. Grace came from the kitchen. She was still in her work clothes with a dish towel over one shoulder, which he had come to understand was her in-process kitchen state, and she looked at the wine and then at him. "That's a good label," she said. "I know it." She took it. Her hand was briefly close to his when she did. She turned back toward the kitchen. Sophie was setting the table 4 places deliberate and neat. She looked at him as he came in and said, "She made the chicken thing." "Is that good?" he said. "It's the one we have when it's a special occasion," she said, not meaningfully, just informatively. He looked at Grace's back. Zoe came up behind him and said, "Sophie, you weren't supposed to say that." "Why not?" Sophie said. "Because—" Zoe stopped. She looked at him. "Because it's not a big deal," she said, not convincingly. "Sophie," Grace said from the kitchen, "can you get the bread?" Sophie got the bread. He sat down at the table. He had sat at this table many times now. He knew which chair wobbled slightly, the one near the window, and he took a different one. He knew the scratch on the wood near the east corner from where Zoe had dragged a project folder last month, and he'd watched her do it, and Grace had closed her eyes for a moment and said, "Zoe." He knew that the chair where Sophie usually sat was the one with the extra cushion put there because the regular chair was slightly too tall for her, and that she had strong opinions about which chair was hers even when the cushion wasn't in it. He knew these things about this table. He had learned them by being here repeatedly in the ordinary way that you learned the geography of a place that mattered to you. Grace brought out the food. She hadn't put on a production of it. She set the dish on the table and opened the wine and poured 2 glasses and set the pitcher of water that Zoe had already filled and sat down. Zoe was already talking about the sleepover, about something that had happened in the middle of the night involving a ceiling fan and a very funny story that required many gestures to tell properly. Sophie ate her chicken with the particular attention she gave to food she liked. She looked at him once and said, "She makes it with lemon." "I can taste that," he said. She looked back at her plate. Something in her posture, still the same quality of evaluation, still reserved, but the tension of it had changed. It was softer now. Still there, still Sophie's, but no longer the protective watchfulness of someone waiting for the moment they'd be proven right about their caution. He thought she's decided. He thought Sophie Monroe, age 10, has decided I'm acceptable. He realized more moved by this than he'd expected to be. He drank his wine and ate his chicken and listened to Zoe's ceiling fan story, which concluded with someone falling off a sleeping bag and the ensuing chaos. And Grace's expression throughout was the combination of finding something genuinely funny and being careful not to encourage Zoe more than was wise. After dinner, the girls did dishes, which was their job on Tuesday evenings, with a level of argument about whose turn it was to dry that lasted exactly as long as Grace's patience allowed, and then they both disappeared upstairs. He helped Grace with the remaining things on the counter. She handed him the serving dish to dry. He dried it. "How did the documentation meeting go?" she said. "Well, it'll be signed by end of month." "Are you glad you did it the modified way?" He thought about it. "Yes." She handed him the pot. He dried it. "Sophie likes you," she said, quietly, not announcing it, just saying it the way you say something that's been decided. "I know," he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, "She doesn't trust easily. She never has. Even with me at the beginning, she needed time." "I know," he said. "You were patient with her. She's worth being patient with." Grace looked at him. He looked back. This was the closest they'd been in terms of physical proximity. Standing at the kitchen counter, passing dishes except for the night of the school dinner in February, and neither of them moved. He was aware of her the way he'd been increasingly aware of her, not with the insistent quality of something unrequited, but with the warm and specific awareness of someone whose proximity means something to you. "Adrian," she said. "Grace," he said. She looked at the dish towel in her hands, then back up at him. She didn't say the thing. He didn't say it either. But they both knew that they were standing in the kitchen after dinner, after 4 months of Portland and phone calls and park mornings and science museums, and that the kitchen was quiet, and the girls were upstairs, and the wine was still on the table, and that something had been building slowly and with patience and care, and that neither of them was afraid of it anymore. He reached out and touched her hand, just briefly. She let him. Then she went back to the sink, and he went back to drying dishes, and upstairs the violin started. Sophie running through a scale, and Zoe called down something that didn't need an answer, and the kitchen was warm and ordinary and full. 3 weeks later, Hargrove called. He was in Portland when it happened. It was a Friday. The acquisition documentation will fully complete, the Brussels partnership signed, and he'd stayed into the weekend because the weekend was there and Portland was there, and he'd stopped needing specific reasons. He was at Grace's kitchen table when the phone rang. Grace was at school for a half day. The girls were at their Saturday soccer, and he was alone in the house doing what he'd come to do in this kitchen, worse in the particular quiet of a house that was lived in, that smelled like coffee and had violin music on a stand by the window, and a half-completed list on the whiteboard that read, "Grocery, eggs, almond milk, the good bread. More drawing papers, Zoe. And do not forget PT conference Thursday." He had been in this house enough times to read the whiteboard. He had been in this house enough times that being alone in it felt comfortable rather than strange. His phone rang. "Adrian," Hargrove said, "I need to talk to you about something separate from the Brussels project." "Okay," he said. "There's a situation with Renwald Media." He named a company that had been on their radar for 2 years, a content moderation AI firm with a significant client base and what Adrian had long considered fundamentally weak ethics infrastructure. They've had a significant incident, internal. It's going to break publicly within the week. The board is asking whether we want to move on them. He knew what move on them meant. An acquisition under distress terms, the kind that came with liability and a rescue narrative and a significant time investment to rebuild. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough to be an opportunity," Hargrove said. "But a 6-month intensive minimum. You'd need to be the primary architect of the turnaround." He was quiet. "I know the timing is..." Hargrove paused. "I know you've been... I want to be direct with you, Adrian. The board has concerns about your availability, not your performance. Your performance has been excellent, but there have been conversations about whether your priorities have shifted in ways that affect our capacity to move when we need to move." He sat with this. "Who's leading these conversations?" he said. "Almeida and Park, not Hargrove. I want you to know that." It was an odd thing for Hargrove to say, distinguishing himself from the other directors. It meant Hargrove was telling him something beyond the official message. "What are you telling me?" Adrian said. A pause. "I'm telling you there's a succession question that was dormant a year ago that's no longer dormant. And I'm telling you that whatever you want for yourself, you should know that clearly, because the board is going to want clarity from you in the next month." He looked at the whiteboard. Grace's handwriting in the grocery section was slightly different from her writing on the conference note, faster. Less deliberate, the writing of someone making a list between other things. "What kind of clarity?" he said. "Whether you want to be CEO for the next 5 years. Specifically, not generically." A pause. "Because if you do, Renwald is the move and you put yourself fully in, and if you don't..." Hargrove's voice was careful. "Then we should have a different conversation." The kitchen was quiet. He could hear the house around him. The particular settling sounds of a house that had been well used, that held the sounds of 2 10-year-olds and their mother in its walls. "I'll call you Monday," he said. "I expected that," Hargrove said. "Monday is fine." He sat at the table for a long time after the call. He did not work. He looked at the whiteboard, at the grocery list, at the note about the parent-teacher conference Thursday. He thought about what Hargrove had said and what it meant. He thought about the first board call 12 years ago when he'd been named CEO at 41, and the board had looked at him with the particular appetite of people investing in a vision. He thought about the 23 years of building the company, of the thing it had become, of what it meant to be the person who'd built it. He thought about October, a bakery, a bell above a door. He was still there when Grace came home at 12:30. Still at the table, his laptop open but not active. She looked at him when she came in. "What happened?" she said. "I got a call," he said. She put her bag down. She came to the table and sat across from him. She waited, which was Grace's particular intelligence. She never filled silence with preemptive responses. She let people arrive at what they needed to say. "The board wants to know if I'm still CEO for the next 5 years," he said. "Fully committed." There's an opportunity that would require it. She looked at him. If I say yes, I take on the Renwald thing, and I'm in for 6 months at minimum intensive, and then the full Brussels engagement on top of it, and then whatever's next. If I say no, he paused. If I say no, I think there's a succession conversation they're going to want to have. What do you want? She said. He looked at her face. She was asking the question straight with no angle on it, no steering. She genuinely wanted to know. I've been thinking about that all morning, he said. And he was quiet for a moment. He looked at the whiteboard, then back at her. I built that company because I believed it was necessary work, he said. I still believe it's necessary work, but I'm not... He stopped. I'm not the only person who can do it. I've built a team that is excellent. I have people who are capable of leading it. I have... He stopped again. What? She said. I have things here, he said. I have things in my life now that I didn't have before, that I didn't know I could have again. He looked at her. And I don't think I want to walk away from them for the next 5 years, not even for a company I built. She was very still. I'm not making this decision based on us, he said, or I am, but not in the way that makes you responsible for it. I'm making it based on who I want to be, and who I want to be is not someone who is somewhere else for the next 5 years. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was moving through something. He waited. Okay, she said. Okay. She put her hand on the table between them, palm up. Not a demand, an offer. He put his hand on hers. They sat like that for a minute in the kitchen in the ordinary Saturday morning of a house that was becoming his home. What will you do? She said. If not CEO? I don't know yet. Found a foundation, maybe. Something that does the work without the board dynamics. He paused. I know how to do the work. I just don't need to be the one holding the title while I do it. Sophie's going to ask you what you do when you tell her, she said. He looked at her. You think I should tell her? I think she'll notice if you seem different. A pause. She notices everything. He thought about this. I know. Grace looked at the table. She wrote the letter to the museum, she said. I figured. They wrote back. She looked up. They said they were going to review the igneous rock coverage in their Earth Sciences exhibit. He sat with this. Sophie told me matter-of-factly, Grace continued, like it was expected, but she showed me the letter twice. He smiled. Good. She said... Grace paused. He was right about the feedback. He was quiet. She said it to me, Grace said. Not to you, because she's Sophie. But... She looked at him. She said it. He looked at Grace's hand under his. He thought about a bakery in October and a girl with a cinnamon roll smear on her cheek saying a word that had landed in his chest. He thought about 8 months of Saturdays and phone calls and soup and pasta and school pickups and a winter concert in a second row and fractions at a kitchen table. He thought Sophie Monroe wrote a letter to a museum and they listened. He thought so did I. I'll call Hargrove Monday, he said. She nodded. And then he said, I'd like to stay for a while, if that's all right. She looked at him with the look. The real one. Not the controlled version, the actual one. The one he'd seen in flashes all these months and had learned slowly was the truest face she had. It's all right, she said. He kept his hand on hers. Outside the Portland window, the June morning was turning into afternoon green and full, the particular lush green of Oregon in the summer that he was starting to know in his body the way you knew the light of a place you'd been in long enough to call familiar. Hey. He called Hargrove Monday. He was precise and clear and unambiguous. He was grateful for everything the company had been, and he was recommending Priya for the permanent CEO role, which surprised Hargrove for about 30 seconds before Hargrove said, She's the best person you've brought on in 8 years. She's the best person I've ever worked with, Adrian said. Full stop. This is real, Hargrove said. It's real. A pause. All right, Hargrove said. He sounded not quite sad, but like a man who understood that endings were sometimes correct and still cost something. What are you going to do? I'm going to take some time and then build a foundation, he said. AI governance work the kind that doesn't need a board's permission. Will you let us be a partner? He thought about it. Yes, he said. If it makes sense. It'll make sense, Hargrove said. You know that. I know, he said. The call ended. He set the phone on his desk in New York for the last full week he would keep this office, and he looked at the city. He had built something here. It was real, and it was good, and he had handed it to the right person, and that was the whole of what he had to do with it. He had other work now. The girls found out in stages the way things were usually revealed in the Monroe household. Not in a formal announcement, but in pieces through Grace and through their own observation and through asking Adrian directly because they were the kind of children who asked directly. Sophie asked first. She found him on the porch one evening in late June during the first week he was staying in Portland properly in a rented place 2 neighborhoods over. She came outside while Grace was finishing dinner preparations and stood next to him at the railing and looked at the street. "You're here more," she said. "I am," he said, "because of work." She said it with the precision of someone who knew the answer was probably no, but wanted to give him the chance to say it himself. "Not because of work," he said. She was quiet. "I changed my job," he said. "I'm going to start something new. It'll take a while to build, but I'll be here while I do it." Sophie was quiet for a bit longer. She was watching a neighbor's cat move along the fence at the edge of the yard with the intent focus of someone tracking data. "Here in Portland," she said. "Yes. Not visiting." "Not visiting. Here." He paused. "If that's okay." She was quiet for another few seconds. "Yes," she said. "That's okay." She went back inside. He heard her say something to Grace in the kitchen, and Grace's low response, and then the sound of the refrigerator opening and closing. He stood on the porch. He thought Sophie Monroe said yes. That's okay. He thought that might be the thing I'm most proud of in a long time. Zoe found out at breakfast the next morning because Zoe found out everything at breakfast, which was when her information processing was at its most associative. She was eating cereal and looked up and said, "Are you moving here?" "I'm going to be here a lot, yes," he said. She stared at him. "Like permanently?" "Like significantly," he said. She stared for another second. Then she put her spoon down and said with great seriousness, "Do you know about the Saturday pancakes?" He looked at Grace. Grace was having her coffee with an expression that meant she had not orchestrated this but was not unhappy with it. "Tell me," he said. Zoe told him. Saturday morning pancakes had been their tradition since Zoe and Sophie were 4 years old, the first full year they'd been home. Grace made them every Saturday, not from a box real ones, the kind with buttermilk. They were, by Zoe's account, extremely important. Sophie would add that the importance was related to the specific recipe and the order of operations, but that the real importance was the morning, which was slow, which did not start until 9, which included the good orange juice from the glass bottles. "That sounds right," he said when Zoe had finished. "You can come on Saturdays," she said, "if you want." "I want," he said. Zoe picked up her spoon. She appeared satisfied. Sophie looked at him from across the table. She had been listening to all of this with the particular patience of someone letting things be confirmed. "She makes them with blueberries sometimes," Sophie said. "In the summer." "Good to know," he said. "It's not a given," Sophie said. "It depends on what's at the market." "I see. I just wanted you to understand it's conditional," she said. "I understand." She went back to her book. He looked at Grace, who was looking at her coffee cup with a small expression that was not quite hidden enough. He thought, this is what it looks like, a family learning to be a family. He thought, I am in it. He thought, I'm not leaving. He'd told his sister in late June, the second time he'd called her in 1 year, the first call being the February call that had made her cry. He was in New York packing up the apartment that was no longer the right one because he'd decided to find a smaller place in New York that he could keep for the times he needed to be there, and a real place in Portland, and this meant dealing with 14 years of accumulated objects, none of which felt particularly important. His sister came to help. She was in New York for 2 days, and she helped him sort through things with the particular practical love of a sister who had been waiting for her brother to do something real for a long time, and was not going to be sentimental about it now that the moment had arrived. She held up a photograph at one point, an old one from the early years of the company, a photo someone had taken at a launch event. He was in it younger, standing at a microphone. He looked certain in the way of people who are 37 and building something and have not yet learned the costs. "This you," she said. "Yes." She looked at it. "You look like you knew what you were doing." "I thought I did," he said. She set it down in the keep pile. "You did know what you were doing," she said. "You just didn't know everything you were doing." She picked up the next thing, a award plaque from a business conference in 2019. She held it sideways. "Keep." "No," he said. She put it in the box for donations. They worked through the afternoon. By evening, the apartment was half empty, and his sister had ordered Thai food, and they ate it sitting on boxes, the way you ate when you were in the middle of a move. "Tell me about them," she said. "Properly," he told her. About Zoe's lists and the pasta and the fractions and the science museum. About Sophie's violin and the notebook and the museum letter, and he was right about the feedback. About Grace, about the Teacher of the Year nomination she'd minimized, and the porch, and the dead plant that had come back, and the night in the kitchen when they'd held hands across the kitchen counter. His sister listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sophie said she'd put your name on the form." "Yes," he said. "That's—" She stopped. Her voice had a quality he didn't often hear from her. "That's everything," she said. "I know," he said. She ate her pad CU for a moment, then, "Don't mess it up." "I know. I'm not being funny. I know how you are when you get close to something that matters. You—" She made a gesture that he understood to mean his particular tendency to pull back at the critical moment to manage from a slight remove when things became genuinely significant. "Don't do that. Not this time." "I'm not," he said. "I haven't been." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm saying it now instead of after." He ate his food. He thought about his sister who had watched him from close and from far for 50 years, who knew his patterns better than almost anyone. "I'm different," he said. "I think I actually am." She looked at him. She had their mother's eyes, which were also slightly his eyes, and she looked at him with them for a long, assessing moment. "Yes," she said. "You are." He nodded. She picked up her chopsticks. "Tell Zoe she can text me about the deep-fried Oreo plan," she said. "I have opinions about which state fair has the best one." He looked at her. "What?" she said. "I've done research." He laughed. Genuinely the whole thing, not the polite one. She looked pleased with herself and ate her food. He thought, "I should have called her more. I should have called her all along." He thought, "I'll call her more now." He did. July in Portland was the surprise of it. He had been in Portland in October and November and December and February and March and April and June, which was to say in every version of gray and green and wet. And he had developed a relationship with the city through those versions, the way the rain was soft, not violent, the way the neighborhoods felt like neighborhoods, the way the coffee places knew their regulars. He had liked it in all those versions. July was different. July was clear and warm, the green going bright and full, the city releasing whatever it had been holding through the long winter and doing it without drama. Just opening, just being itself in the best version. He was renting a place in Hawthorne, which was less a strategic choice than a consequence. The first place he'd looked at was 2 blocks from the bakery on the corner, and he'd rented it because the light was good and the kitchen was large enough to work in, and because 2 blocks from the bakery meant 12 blocks from Grace's house, which was a distance that felt intentional without being presumptuous. He was learning the city properly now, not as a visitor, not as someone in hotels. He'd found the coffee place where they knew how he took his order and didn't ask anymore. He'd found the trail along the river. He went on Tuesday and Thursday mornings where the light came through the trees at a particular angle just past 7 that made the whole walk worth the early alarm. He'd found the market on Saturday mornings where you could get the right tomatoes, and the woman who sold honey in small jars, and the place near the end where they had the good pears. The pears were important because Sophie cared about pears. He had learned this in June when he'd brought fruit to dinner, and Grace had looked at the pear in his bag and said, "Sophie will love you for this," which was an overstatement that was not entirely an overstatement. He went to the market on Saturdays and he bought pears. He started the foundation in July. It was not fast work. It was the slow, deliberate work of building something from nothing, which he knew how to do, had done before, but which felt different at 53 than it had at 31. More intentional, less driven by the need to prove something. He called it the AI Accountability Project. He had a website built simple and clear. He hired 3 people from his existing network. Priya sent him 2 of them, which said something about Priya that he already knew. He set up a small office in the Hawthorne neighborhood, 2 rooms, which was enough for now. He worked on it in the mornings mostly, and in the afternoons he was available for whatever the afternoon was. The afternoons were many things. He drove the girls to swim camp 4 times in July because Grace had a professional development week and had needed coverage. He was not entirely prepared for swim camp, which involved early drop-off, and the particular logistics of 2 children who managed their swim gear with different degrees of organization. Zoe's approach was aspirational. Sophie's was systematic, and the parking situation at the pool, which did not accommodate his schedule, and the second morning when he arrived with Zoe's swim bag. But not Sophie's swim bag, which he had thought was in the car, and was in fact still on the hall bench where he'd set it down to lock the door. He drove back for the bag while Zoe waited at the pool entrance with a specific and uncharitable commentary on the situation. He got the bag. He returned. Sophie, who had been waiting in the lobby with her arms folded, accepted the bag with an expression that said she was choosing not to say what she wanted to say. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's fine," she said. "It won't happen again." "I know," she said. Not generously, just with confidence, because once Sophie updated a model, the model was updated. He drove home having been precisely corrected by a 10-year-old and feeling oddly good about it. He told Grace that evening. She laughed, the real laugh, the one from the park in October that had arrived in his sternum and stayed. He'd heard it more often now, the real version, not the polite one, not the held-back one, and each time it arrived the same way with the same specific quality of something being genuinely present. "Sophie didn't say it was fine," Grace said. "She said it twice," he said. "That means she means something different." "I know," he said. "I know." Grace's sister was visiting in late July. Her name was Patricia, and she had lived in London for a decade, which she described as temporary for the first 7 years, and had now accepted as permanent. She was 52, 2 years younger than Grace, and had the quality of someone who had decided at some point to be exactly as much as she was, and not perform anything else. She arrived on a Wednesday, and he met her Thursday evening at Grace's house, where Grace had made dinner for 5. Patricia looked at him across the table with the directness of a woman who had been waiting to form an opinion and was now forming it. "You're the one," she said. "Patricia," Grace said. "What? He knows he is." Patricia looked at him without apology. "She told me about you. In October, after the bakery thing. She called me at midnight London time." "I did not call at midnight," Grace said. 11:50. Nearly midnight. She was... Patricia looked at Grace, something warm and slightly mischievous, not calm about it. "I was calm," Grace said. "You called me from the porch." "The house was loud," Sophie said from across the table with perfect composure. "There's no one in the house at midnight." "I was getting some air," Grace said. Zoe was watching this exchange with the bright interest of someone at a sporting event. Patricia looked at Adrian. "She was not calm," she said. He said nothing. He looked at his plate. "It's a compliment," Patricia said. "She's been calm for a long time, too calm, controlled." She said this with the precision of a sister who had observed something over years. "Whatever you've done, it's..." She looked at Grace again. "The girls told me you're here now." "I'm here now," he said. "Good." She picked up her fork. "Good." And that was apparently the verdict. Grace was looking at her own plate with the expression of someone who has resigned themselves to a thing. He caught her eye. She looked at him for a second and then looked down, but the corner of her mouth had moved. He thought her sister called her not calm. He thought, this is good to know. After dinner, Zoe sat with Patricia and showed her the geography project she'd finished for school, and Sophie played violin upstairs, and he helped Grace with the dishes again. "Your sister is forthright," he said. "She's been living in London," Grace said. "She's lost the filter." "I liked it." She handed him the pan. He dried it. "She called it at midnight," he said. Grace looked at the sink. "It was earlier in Portland. You were on the porch." The house felt, she paused, small. He looked at her profile. "I didn't know what it meant," she said. "Running into you. I didn't know if I was handling it correctly or I was running different scenarios." She set down the dish in her hand and looked at the kitchen wall. "I'd worked hard not to need anything I didn't have. I'd built a good life. The girls were good. I was..." She paused. "I was okay. Really. Not performing okay. Actually okay." "I know," he said. "And then you walked into a bakery." She looked at him. "And I was suddenly not sure what okay meant." He set down his dish towel. He turned to look at her. "I called Patricia," she said, "because I needed someone who knew both sides. She knew what we were. She was there for some of the hard parts. And I needed to say out loud." She stopped. "What?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "That I was scared," she said. "That you were standing in the bakery and I was scared and it meant something." He was very still. "I haven't said that to you before," she said. "No," he said. "I'm saying it now." The kitchen was quiet. Upstairs, the violin had stopped. From the living room, Zoe's voice and Patricia's a story being told with gestures. He said, "I was scared too." She looked at him. "In the hotel the night after I saw you, I was lying in the dark thinking about a 7-year-old who'd looked at me and said a word, and it was the most frightened I've been in years." He looked at her. "Frightened that it was too late, that I'd used up whatever I had to offer, and that..." He stopped. "That I didn't have the right kind of life to show up and be part of what you'd built." She looked at him for a long time. "You do," she said. He nodded. "You do," she said again, firmer, like she needed to be clear. He looked at her face. Grace Monroe, at 48, in her kitchen on a Thursday evening in July, with her sister and her daughters, and the dishes half done, and her hair catching the kitchen light the same way it had in the bakery 8 months ago. He stepped closer. She didn't move back. He touched her face, just his hand on her cheek, and she let him, and they stood like that in the kitchen in the ordinary evening. "Grace?" he said. "Yes," she said. Not to a question, just yes. He kissed her. Quietly, and without event, the way things happened in a kitchen with people in the next room and the world going on around them. She kissed him back. When they pulled back, she looked at him with the full look, the real one, and then she said, "I need to check on Patricia and Zoe." "Yes," he said. She picked up her dish towel. He picked up his. Upstairs, the violin started again. August. He had a routine. This was new, not routines in the professional sense, which he'd always had, but personal ones. Daily ones that were not organized around productivity. The Tuesday-Thursday trail run. The Saturday market. The morning coffee at the place on Hawthorne, where they knew his order. The Tuesday evening dinner at Grace's when she didn't have other plans. The Wednesday evening call with Priya about the foundation's work, because Priya had become a collaborator and he valued that. He had a life in Portland. He was making it. The foundation's first project launched in August, an independent audit of 3 major content moderation systems looking specifically at how the AI decision-making was documented and whether it was genuinely transparent or transparent in form. The work was careful and detailed and required expertise he'd hired for. It was not flashy. It would not make headlines unless the findings were significant enough to demand them. He liked it. He liked the work itself, the narrowness of it, the specificity. He'd spent 23 years managing complexity at scale, and there was something, not relief exactly, but a different quality of engagement in doing the same careful thing at smaller scale, where he could see the work and follow it. Priya wrote him an email in mid-August that said, "The board approved the ethics committee charter. I used your framework. They said it felt like it had been there all along." He wrote back, "That's how good frameworks feel." She replied, "I'm going to steal that for the keynote." He told her to go ahead.
Ma.
In late August, Sophie got into the youth symphony. The letter came on a Thursday afternoon. He knew because Grace texted him. She got in. And then 3 minutes later, she's reading it again in her room. She's read it 3 times. He wrote back, "Tell her I said congratulations." A minute later, she says, "Thank you." She also says she has to work on the Vivaldi before September. He smiled at his phone. He was in his Hawthorne office a Tuesday, working through a draft of the audit methodology. He looked at the phone for a moment and thought about a December evening in a school auditorium, a girl in a dark dress raising her bow the moment she'd found them in the second row. He thought about how many things she had not had access to. He thought about the letter from the museum still on a shelf in Sophie's room because Grace had told him it was there and that Sophie dusted around it without moving it. He thought about he was right about the feedback said to Grace, not to him, because Sophie handled things obliquely. He thought about how much he would have missed if he hadn't gone to Portland for a meeting in October and walked in a direction he hadn't planned on and pushed open a door with a bell above it. He went back to his methodology. He worked for another hour. At 4:30, he closed his laptop and drove to the market and bought pears. September. Sophie's first youth symphony rehearsal was on a Saturday morning. He drove her. Grace could have driven her, had offered to drive her, but Sophie had looked at him across the breakfast table and said, with the particular economy of Sophie's important statements, "You can drive me." He drove her. She was quiet in the car, which was Sophie's version of pre-game focus. She had her violin on her lap, her music in a folder in her bag, her hair up the way it had been at the school concert. She looked out the window. He did not make conversation. He drove. When they got to the rehearsal space, a room in a community center that was functional rather than elegant, she got out of the car with her violin and her bag and stood on the sidewalk. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "Good luck," he said. She turned to go. Then she turned back. "Sophie Pierce," she said with a completely neutral expression. He looked at her. "That's what I'm going to put on the registration form," she said. "If that's—" She stopped. "Then Mom said it's my choice." He was very still. Sophie looked at him with the diagnostic look checking. "If that's all right," she said. "Not small, just careful." Sophie was always careful. "Sophie," he said. "What?" "Yes," he said. "That's more than all right." She looked at him for one more second, then she nodded in the way she nodded when a hypothesis had been confirmed. and she went inside. He sat in the car in the parking lot for a while. He was 53 years old, and a 10-year-old had told him what name she planned to put on a form. He sat with that in the way that the most important things required you to sit with them. Not analyzing, not filing, just receiving. He drove home. He called Grace. She told me, Grace said when she picked up. I know. She told me last night. A pause. She asked me if I thought it was too much to ask. What did you say? I said it was her choice. I said he'd probably... She stopped. I didn't tell her what you'd say. I said it was her choice and her story. It is, he said. He was driving through the Portland morning, the September light coming through the trees, the city doing its September thing, not quite summer anymore. The green beginning its long conversation with autumn again. Come for breakfast, Grace said. The girls will be back. Zoe has something she wants to show you. What? She won't tell me. She says it's a surprise. I've decided to treat this as a positive sign. He smiled. I'll be there. He drove to the house on Southeast Clatsop, the familiar street, the house with the porch and the once dead pot, now fully alive with something he'd helped replant in June. He parked. He got out. Grace opened the door before he reached it. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was nothing left to negotiate in the look. No architecture, no control. Just Grace at her own door on a Saturday morning in September, already knowing what the morning would be, already knowing what the day would be, and looking at him with the full face, the real one. You're early, she said. It's possible. She stepped back to let him in.
But
The morning was pancakes. Grace made them with buttermilk and a particular method he'd watched enough times to almost know the batter, not overmix the pan at a specific heat. The first one always a test. She moved through it with the ease of someone who'd been doing it every Saturday for 6 years, and he sat at the table with his coffee and watched. Zoe came downstairs at 9:15 in the specific state of 10-year-olds on Saturdays, slightly disorganized. Still warm from sleep, her hair pulled back in a way she'd done herself, and which was tilted about 15 degrees from level. You're here, she said. I'm here. She got herself a glass of orange juice, the good kind from the glass bottles, and sat across from him. She looked at him with the evaluation, but the relaxed version of it, the version that had existed for months now, in which he was a known quantity, and the evaluation was more habit than necessity. I have something to show you, she said. I heard. After pancakes, she said firmly. After pancakes, he agreed. Sophie came downstairs at 9:30, fully dressed, her violin already in its case by the door where she'd set it before bed. She sat down and poured herself orange juice and looked at the table. How'd it go? Zoe said to her. Good, Sophie said. How good? Sophie looked at the juice. The conductor said I have precise intonation. What does that mean? It means I play the notes correctly. Is that good? Yes, Sophie said with the restraint of someone who has decided not to say more. Zoe looked at Adrian. He shrugged slightly, meaning that's Sophie's version of extremely well. Zoe seemed to accept this interpretation. Grace put plates on the table, the good plates with the blue edge and the syrup and the butter, and then she sat down and looked at the four of them around the table, and something in her face went quiet. Not sad, not overwhelmed, just present. The way a person looked when the thing they'd been building was in front of them and was real. He looked at her. She looked at him. He looked back at the table. He took a pancake and passed the plate. Zoe took two. Sophie took one, then with measured deliberateness took half a second. Grace took one and cut it with the particular neat precision that was Grace's precision that he'd been watching for 8 months. Outside, the September morning was doing its thing, the leaves starting to turn at the edges, the light with its autumnal angle, the particular quality of September that felt like a beginning, even though it was technically an ending of summer. He had always felt that September was the real start of things. He had felt it even as a child before he'd known why. He thought about October a year ago. The airport in Denver, the sparkling water, the birthday no one had said anything about. The apartment on the 14th floor, and Gerald at the door, and the particular marble echo. The flight to Portland. The walk with no destination. The bakery. The bell. The warmth. He thought about a girl swinging her legs under a table and a cinnamon roll going cold on its plate, and a word that had moved through the air and landed. He was here. He had arrived. He cut his pancake. Zoe said, "Okay. Are you ready for my thing?" "I've been ready," he said. She disappeared from the table and returned 30 seconds later with a notebook. Not Sophie's small technical one. A larger one, spiral-bound, with a drawing on the cover that he recognized as her own work, a house with a porch and 4 stick figures and a dog, though they did not not have a dog. I've been working on this since January, she said. He looked at the notebook. It's a list, she said, of things I want to do. He opened it. Inside, Zoe Monroe's handwriting, which was larger and rounder than Sophie's, filling the pages. Items? Make fresh pasta done. April. Go to the state fair and eat a deep-fried Oreo. See the Northern Lights, Sophie's too. Go to New York and see Central Park. Help Sophie write a letter to a place-done museum. Do a science project that actually matters. Get a dog on going. Have pancake Saturdays forever. He read it. He read it again, Grace said softly from across the table. She showed me last week. She said she wanted you to see it too. He looked at Zoe. She was watching him with the expression that was undefended in the way that 10-year-olds were only undefended when they decided to be, which was rarer than it looked. It's a good list, he said. I add to it, she said. You should keep adding to it. She nodded. She reached across and turned to a new page. She picked up the pen that was tucked in the spiral. She wrote in the careful large letters, See Sophie in the Youth Symphony, September. She turned the page again. She wrote, Be a family. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Is it a plan or is it already done? He said. She considered this. Both, she said. He nodded. She put the pen back and closed the notebook. Sophie said from behind her glass of orange juice without inflection, The dog is not happening. You don't know that, Zoe said. Mom said no. Mom said we'd discuss it. That means no, Sophie said. That means we'd discuss it, Zoe said. Zoe, Grace said. I'm just saying. Eat your pancakes. Zoe ate her pancake. But she looked at Adrian with the expression of someone who had noted a potential ally. He looked at his own pancake. Grace saw this. She looked at him with the look that said, Do not. He looked at his plate. He cut another piece of pancake. Sophie, watching all of this, said quietly from behind her orange juice, with the ghost of something that was almost but not quite a smile. She's going to ask about the dog forever. I know, Grace said. I know, Adrian said. Sophie looked at him, then at Grace, then back at her pancake. This is my favorite day, Zoe said. Nobody responded immediately. The kitchen held the ordinary Saturday morning sounds, orange juice being poured, a plate moved the street outside with its quiet weekend traffic. Then Adrian said, Mine too. He meant it. He meant it the way that true things were meant, not as a declaration, not as a performance, just as a fact. He was delivering to the room because the room was the right place for it. Grace looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the September Portland morning was moving slowly toward 10 o'clock. The light full and clear, the green and gold of the turning year. The bakery 2 blocks over opening its door and letting out its particular smell of butter and warm bread. And somewhere in the city, a youth symphony was scheduling its first full rehearsal, and a small notebook on the kitchen table had a list of things that were wanted and things that were done and things that were both. Zoe reached for her second pancake. Sophie turned a page. The morning went on. This was the life. This had always been the life. He had just needed to stop moving long enough to arrive in it. And he thought about this later, not that day, but in the weeks after the gradual settling of the fall. He thought about the question of how much of life was simply showing up and how much was recognizing the place you'd arrived in as the place you'd needed. He had spent most of his adult life optimizing, analyzing the landscape, identifying the highest value path, moving along it with the efficiency of a person who had confused productivity for living. Not out of greed, the company had never been primarily about money. He'd always known that, which was why the ethics work had felt central and not incidental. Out of something more like fear, maybe. Or habit. The habit of movement as a proxy for purpose. He thought, now very good at the wrong thing for a long time. Not entirely wrong. The company was real and the work was meaningful, and the people he'd built it with had built something that mattered. He wasn't dismissing it. He was just placing it correctly for the first time. It was one of the things, not the main thing. The main thing was breakfast, not literally breakfast, but the ordinary accumulation that breakfast stood for, the specific flavor of a person's life, the unspectacular dailiness of it, the things that happened between the significant events and which constituted, when you added them up, the actual thing. He had been missing the actual thing for a very long time. But he told Priya in October about the Foundation's next phase of work. They were on a call a Wednesday, and she was asking intelligent questions about scope, and he was answering. And at some point she said, You sound different, specifically, not just settled. Happy, he said. The word surprised him slightly. He used it anyway. She was quiet for a second. Good, she said. Really good. Don't tell the board. The board should know, she said. I'll tell them it's an improvement in resource allocation. He laughed. I'm serious, she said. People do better work when they're, she paused, when they have something worth doing the work for. He thought about this after the call. He thought about what it meant to have something worth doing the work for. He had thought for a long time that the work was the thing, the company, the building, the making of something from nothing. And it had been. It had mattered. But it had also been he was starting to understand the thing he used to fill a space that was actually meant to be filled by people. People were harder than companies. They didn't respond to good strategy and clear metrics. They changed their minds and had bad days and asked questions you didn't have answers to and needed things from you that you couldn't always provide. They required you to be present in a way that was not efficient. He had finally stopped finding this frustrating. He'd started finding it the point. October came again. A full year since the bakery. He noticed this on the morning of the 14th, which was a Saturday, because he'd woken up at 7 in his Hawthorne apartment and looked at the date on his phone and done the math. He drove to Grace's house at 8:30, an hour earlier than the standard arrival for Saturday pancakes. She answered the door in her robe, which meant the girls were not yet up, which meant she'd been awake alone with her coffee in the particular early Saturday quiet he'd seen enough times to know. She looked at him. You're early, she said. I know. It's 8:30. It's a year, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back. He came in. The house had the early quiet. His good coffee, his good Saturday, his good life. She went to the kitchen. He followed. She poured him a cup and they sat at the table in the early morning before the girls came down and the Portland October morning was outside the window doing what October did. Cool and clear, the leaves starting their business, the particular light. A year, she said. Approximately, he said. She looked at her cup, then at him. I was very controlled that day, she said. I know. I was absolutely terrified. I know, he said. I was too. She looked at him. Are you still? He thought about it. No, he said. I'm not. She nodded. Are you? He said. She looked at her coffee. Then, no. She said it like she was confirming something she'd been checking and rechecking and had finally found consistently true. No, I'm not. He reached across his table and took her hand. She let him. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that in the October morning. Upstairs a footstep. Then another. Then the particular sequence of sounds that meant Zoe always first was navigating the morning. The footsteps on the stairs. Zoe appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair loose, yesterday's socks blinking at the light. She looked at them holding hands at the table. She looked at them for a long second doing the evaluation. Then she said as if this were simply the next piece of information available to her, Are we making pancakes? Yes, Grace said. Good. She went to the refrigerator for her orange juice. Sophie's almost awake. She was reading when I came past. She's always reading, Adrian said. I know. Zoe poured her juice. She looked at them. Is this... She stopped. Started again. Are you okay? We're good, Grace said. Zoe looked at their hands. Okay, she said. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. Zoe, who had started this whole thing by saying a word in a bakery, had received the answer and was apparently satisfied. She went to her chair. She put her glass down. She looked at him. I was right, she said. In the bakery. He looked at her. She said it matter-of-factly, no particular emphasis, just a thing she needed acknowledged. I knew it when I saw you. I don't know how. I just knew. He looked at Grace. Grace was looking at Zoe with the face, the full one. He looked at Zoe. Yes, he said. You were right. She seemed satisfied. She drank her juice. Sophie appeared in the doorway with her book and her still-focused morning expression. She looked at the table, at Zoe, at Grace, at Adrian, at their hands. She said nothing. She sat down. She opened her book. Grace got up and started the pancakes. He got up and helped her. Behind them, Zoe told Sophie something about yesterday's homework, and Sophie responded with one sentence without looking up from the page. And the kitchen filled with the sounds that it always filled with. On Saturday mornings, the batter, the pan, the particular voices of two girls who would never fully stop arguing about small things and would never stop being what they were to each other. He stood beside Grace at the stove. She handed him the spatula. He took it. He thought, this is the life. He thought, I will not take it for granted. He thought I am 53 years old, standing in a kitchen in Portland, Oregon, and the most accurate thing I know about myself is that I am here, and I am staying, and this is enough, and it is more than enough. It is everything. He flipped a pancake. Grace looked at it. That one's perfect, she said. It's the practice, he said. She smiled. He handed it to Zoe, who received it with the gravity it deserved. The October light came through the window. The morning went on.